Welcome to In the Shadows. I'm Jack, your guide through tonight's show of eerie, scary stories to help you fall asleep. No ads, no light, just a black screen and the soft sound of rain. Let yourself drift as the stories unfold. Before we start, leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious, and it brings me comfort knowing you're here. If these stories help you relax, remember to like and subscribe. Now, close your eyes and settle in. It all started when Jack called me about this hidden gem of an island he'd found on some obscure camping forum, a place no one had been to in decades, which, of course, made it irresistible to him. I wasn't exactly jumping at the idea of camping on an island no one talks about anymore, but Jack had a way of making everything sound like an adventure, and I figured, what's the worst that could happen? We set off early, heading to the harbor where Jack had rented a small motorboat. The kind that's barely big enough for 2 people and some camping gear, but enough to get us where we needed to go. The sky was already heavy with clouds, and the forecast said we'd be hit with rain by nightfall, so we wanted to make it to the island before that happened. But I remember thinking the water looked darker than usual, like it knew something we didn't. As we crossed the water, the island finally came into view. Barely more than a silhouette against the darkening sky, and even though I couldn't explain why, something about it made me uneasy. But Jack, as always, was grinning like this was the best idea he'd ever had. He was rambling about how the island had been abandoned since the 1930s, how a group of campers had supposedly vanished without a trace, and I played along, laughing it off as one of those urban legends people make up to scare kids. But the way the mist started rolling in over the water made me stop smiling. We reached the island just as the sun dipped below the horizon, but with the clouds so thick, it felt like night had fallen early, and when we docked the boat, I noticed how quiet it was, like the whole place was holding its breath. The shoreline was rocky, and the trees loomed over us as we dragged the boat up the beach, unloading our gear while the mist crept closer. And for a second, I thought I saw something move in the fog. But Jack didn't seem to notice, so I told myself I was imagining things. We found a small clearing not too far from the shore and set up the tent, Jack already joking about how we'd picked the perfect spot, and I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right, focusing instead on getting the fire started before the rain hit us. But as we sat around the fire, the rain started falling heavier, tapping against the trees with an almost rhythmic sound, and I could see the mist creeping between the branches, curling around the trunks like it belonged there. Jack didn't seem bothered by any of it, cracking open a beer and settling back with that same grin on his face, like this was just another trip for us. But I couldn't ignore the way the mist moved, slow but deliberate, like it had a purpose. I told him I was going to walk down to the shore, maybe to clear my head, maybe just to see if the boat was still there, because part of me was starting to feel like something wasn't adding up. When I reached the beach, the rain was coming down harder, and the water was almost impossible to see through the fog. But as I stood there, I noticed something strange, a faint glow hovering just above the surface of the water. At first, I thought it might be the moon, but there was no moon tonight, hidden behind the thick clouds. And there were no boats either, just that eerie, soft light floating on the mist, drifting slowly, almost as if it was watching me. I stared at it for longer than I probably should have, trying to make sense of it, but nothing about it made sense, and I had this overwhelming urge to turn back before I saw anything else I didn't want to see. When I got back to the camp, Jack was already laughing about something, the firelight flickering in his eyes. And I didn't mention the light to him, because part of me didn't want to believe it had even happened. But as I sat down by the fire, trying to push the strange feeling out of my mind, the rain kept falling and the mist kept creeping, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be here. Not tonight. Not ever. The rain didn't let up throughout the night, turning the ground beneath us into mud as the fire struggled to stay alive. its flickering light casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should have. Jack was still unfazed, poking at the fire with a stick, talking about how tomorrow we'd explore the island and see if we could find anything left behind from the 1930s. But I wasn't really listening. My focus was on the fog still creeping closer from the shore. There was something about the mist that was different from anything I'd seen before. Something off about the way it moved, like it was following us. Or worse, like it was waiting for us to do something, though I couldn't say what. I tried to shake off the thought, blaming the isolation and the weather for getting into my head. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I noticed little things. Like the way the air seemed thicker, heavier, and the way every sound seemed muffled, like the island itself was swallowing it up. Eventually we decided to call it a night and crawled into the tent, the rain tapping relentlessly against the fabric as Jack drifted off almost immediately. But sleep didn't come so easily for me. The sound of the rain, once calming, had taken on a strange rhythm, like it was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't make out what it was, and every so often I thought I could hear something else beneath it, something faint, almost like a whisper. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was just the wind, or the rain playing tricks on me. But no matter how many times I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the reach of the tent's dim glow. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but it wasn't restful. When I woke up, it was still dark, and for a moment I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep until I realized that something was missing. The sound of the rain had stopped, leaving only a heavy silence that felt wrong in the most unsettling way. I reached over to nudge Jack, but before I could wake him, I heard it again. The faint whispering, barely audible but definitely there, coming from somewhere outside the tent. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the more I focused, the harder it became to make out the words, as though they were slipping through the cracks in my mind, never fully forming into something I could understand. It was like the island was speaking, not in any language I knew, but in something older, something that didn't belong to this place or this time. And I couldn't shake the feeling that if I listened too closely, I'd lose myself in it. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a silence that felt even more oppressive, and I was just about to wake Jack when I heard something else, a sound I hadn't expected, something that sent a cold realization creeping up my spine. The boat, it was gone. I scrambled out of the tent, ignoring the wet mud beneath my feet, and ran to the shore, hoping, praying that I was wrong. But when I reached the beach, the truth was undeniable. The boat we had dragged so carefully up the shore was no longer there. The only thing left behind were the faint marks in the sand where it had once been. Jack joined me a moment later, his usual bravado gone as he stared at the empty shoreline, his voice barely a whisper as he asked the question we were both thinking. How the hell did it just disappear? We both knew there was no way the boat could have drifted off on its own, not in this kind of weather. And even if it had, the current would have pushed it back toward the shore, not pulled it away into the open water. I tried to scan the water for any sign of it, but the mist was so thick now that I could barely see past the first few feet, let alone all the way to the horizon. And the same eerie glow I'd seen the night before was back, only this time it seemed closer, as if it had followed us to the shore. Jack was pacing now, muttering under his breath about how this didn't make any sense, how we were stranded, how there had to be some explanation, but no matter how many times he said it, neither of us could come up with anything that didn't sound insane. The island, once just a curious, abandoned place, now felt hostile, like it was playing with us, toying with the idea of letting us think we were safe before pulling the rug out from under us. And as we stood there staring into the fog, the realization hit us both at the same time. We were no longer just camping on some forgotten island. We were trapped on it. The reality of the situation hit us hard, but there was no time to dwell on it. Jack was already trying to come up with a plan, pacing back and forth near the shore, throwing out ideas that didn't seem to lead anywhere. We could try to swim, but the fog was so thick, and the distance back to the mainland was a mystery now that the horizon had vanished. We could try to build a signal fire, but something in me, something I couldn't quite put into words, told me that no one would see it, that no one would even know we were here. The island felt different now, like we weren't just lost but forgotten by the rest of the world. Jack's confidence was fading fast. I could see it in the way he kept looking out over the water, as if expecting the boat to just reappear, as if this was all some mistake that would sort itself out. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that we were on our own. I suggested we explore the island, search for anything that might give us a clue about what was happening. Jack didn't like the idea, but he didn't have a better one, so we grabbed what little gear we had left and set off into the trees, hoping that maybe, just maybe, we'd find something that would explain all of this. The deeper we went into the island, the more the landscape began to change. At first, it was subtle. Trees that looked just a little too similar, paths that seemed to loop back on themselves, but soon it became impossible to ignore. The island was shifting around us, twisting the terrain into something unfamiliar, something deliberately disorienting. We found ourselves back at the abandoned campsite we'd stumbled upon the day before, only now it didn't look as old as it had before. The tattered tents were still there, the rusted equipment still scattered about, but there was something different. The journal we had seen lying in the dirt was open now, the pages fresh and clean, the handwriting crisp, as if it had just been written. Jack picked it up, flipping through the pages as his face twisted in confusion. The entries were dated from the 1930s, but the ink looked fresh, the paper not yellowed with age like it should have been. The more we read, the worse the feeling got. The journal talked about the island in ways that made no sense, about how time didn't work the way it should here, about how the island was never in the same place twice, about how those who came here never left. Jack's hands tightened around the journal as he read the last few entries aloud. The words described exactly what we were experiencing. The fog, the lights over the water, the shifting landscape. It was like the island had been playing the same game with different people over and over again, and we were just the latest to fall into its trap. We needed to leave, but without the boat, we were stuck. Jack kept insisting that there had to be a way off the island, but even he didn't seem to believe it anymore. We both knew that whatever this place was, it wasn't going to let us go that easily. As we stood there, the mist began to creep closer, swirling around us in thick, dense waves. And with it came that same faint glow, the one that had been hovering over the water since we arrived. It was moving toward us now, the light pulsing gently like it was alive, like it was drawing nearer with purpose. The journal slipped from Jack's hands as we both stared at the light, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The whispers started again, soft at first but growing louder, filling the air around us with voices that didn't belong to this world. They were speaking in languages I didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. They were calling to us, beckoning us closer, pulling us deeper into the island's grasp. Jack snapped out of it first, grabbing my arm and pulling me back toward the shore, his voice shaking as he muttered something about needing to get away from the light. But no matter how fast we ran, no matter how hard we tried to escape, the island wasn't letting us go. The trees around us blurred into one another, the ground shifting beneath our feet as the island itself was trying to confuse us, trying to keep us lost. Every path we took seemed to lead us back to the same spot, back to the edge of the water where the light waited for us, glowing brighter with each passing second. We didn't stop running until we reached the rocky beach where our camp was, or at least where it should have been. But when we got there, everything was gone. The tent, the fire pit, even the footprints we had left in the sand. All of it had vanished, as if we had never been there in the first place. The realization hit me hard. The island wasn't just shifting the landscape, it was erasing us. Jack was panicking now, pacing in circles as he tried to come up with a plan, any plan, but there was nothing left for us to do. The light was growing closer, the mist swirling around us like it was alive, and the whispers were louder now, almost deafening, filling my head with thoughts that weren't my own. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. No way off the island. And that's when I saw it. The boat. It was back, floating just off the shore, untouched, as if it had never disappeared in the first place. But something was wrong. The mist clung to it like a living thing, the glowing light reflecting off the water around it, and the whispers grew louder the closer we got. Jack didn't care. He ran for it, wading into the water without hesitation, shouting for me to follow. But I hesitated, something in the back of my mind screaming that this wasn't right, that the boat wasn't what it seemed. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the glowing mist, trying to decide if this was really our way out, or just another trick the island was playing. Jack was already knee-deep in the water, splashing toward the boat with frantic energy, yelling at me to hurry, but I couldn't take my eyes off the mist that clung to the boat, like it was alive, like it was waiting for us to make a choice. Something about it wasn't right, and the closer I looked, the more I could see that the mist wasn't just fog or vapor. There were shapes in it, figures almost shifting and writhing just beneath the surface. I felt a deep sense of unease settle over me, but Jack was too far gone in his desperation to notice. He clambered into the boat, grabbing one of the oars, waving for me to join him, and for a moment I thought about doing it, thought about following him and getting the hell off that island, but I couldn't move, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The whispers were louder now, all around us, no longer faint and distant, but close, invasive, pressing into my head like they were trying to root themselves inside my thoughts, pulling at me with a force I couldn't fully comprehend. I took a step back from the shore, my feet sinking into the wet sand as the whispers grew more urgent, more demanding, and that's when I realized this wasn't a boat anymore. Not really. The mist wrapped around it like tendrils, pulling it deeper into the fog, and the light, that strange, glowing light, seemed to pulse in time with the whispers, like it was feeding off Jack's panic, off his desperation to escape. I shouted for him to stop, to get out of the boat, but he couldn't hear me over the crashing waves and the rising wind. Or maybe he just didn't want to hear me. Maybe he was so focused on getting off the island that he couldn't see what I was seeing. The boat, or what was left of it, wasn't moving like it should. The oar Jack was trying to use dipped into the water, but instead of pushing the boat forward, it seemed to sink deeper into the fog, like the island was holding it back, like it wasn't going to let him leave that easily. I could see Jack's frustration as he tried to row harder, but the boat wasn't responding. It was just sitting there, drifting in place, surrounded by that swirling mist, and the shapes in the fog were becoming clearer now, vague, human-like figures that seemed to float just beneath the surface of the water, their features indistinct, but undeniably there. The journal's warnings flashed through my mind. The island doesn't let people leave. It doesn't work like other places. Time, space, reality, none of it functioned the way it should here. And the island had a way of trapping those who came too close, those who thought they could escape. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far from that shore as possible, but Jack was still out there, still trying to row toward an escape that didn't exist anymore. And I couldn't just leave him behind. I called out to him again, louder this time, trying to cut through the wind and the whispers, but all I could hear was the sound of the oar splashing uselessly against the water. And then, something else, something that made my blood run cold. The light was moving. At first, it had seemed stationary, hovering just above the surface of the water like some kind of distant, eerie glow, but now it was getting closer, drifting toward the boat, growing brighter with each second. Jack still hadn't noticed. He was too busy fighting the current, too focused on trying to get the boat to move, but I could see it. Whatever that light was, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't just some atmospheric phenomenon. It was alive, and it was coming for him. I screamed for him to get out, to abandon the boat and swim back to shore, but Jack wasn't listening anymore. He was too far gone in his own head, too desperate to see what was right in front of him. And then it happened. The light reached the boat, enveloping it in that glowing mist, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The wind stopped, The water stilled, even the whispers seemed to pause as if the island itself was holding its breath. Jack turned to look at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with something like realization. But before he could say anything, before he could even react, the boat disappeared. There was no splash, no sound, no warning. One moment it was there, Jack sitting in it. The next, it was gone, swallowed by the mist, taken by whatever force had been pulling at it all along. I stumbled back from the shore, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation. Jack, the boat, everything had just vanished, like it had never been there in the first place. The whispers started again, louder now, more insistent, but I couldn't understand them, couldn't make sense of the voices swirling around me. All I knew was that the island wasn't finished with me yet, and if I didn't find a way out soon, I'd be next. The journal had mentioned something about slipping through the right moment, about finding the one point when the island let you go, and I knew somehow that this was it. I had to leave now, before the island closed its grip around me too. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get as far from the shore as possible, needing to escape whatever it was that had taken Jack, knowing that if I stayed any longer, I'd never leave. I don't remember much of what happened after I started running. I just knew that I had to get away, get off the island before it claimed me too. The trees blurred together as I stumbled through the forest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the whispers continued to surround me, growing louder, more urgent. The ground beneath me seemed to shift with every step, twisting and warping like the island itself was fighting against me, trying to confuse me, to keep me trapped in its grasp. I don't know how long I ran, or how far I got, but at some point I broke through the tree line and found myself back on the rocky beach. And there it was, the boat. Not the one Jack had been in, but our boat, the one we had dragged onto shore when we first arrived, the one that had disappeared without a trace. It was back, sitting exactly where we'd left it, as if it had never been gone at all. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. I couldn't explain it, couldn't understand how it had reappeared, but I didn't have time to think. I had to get off the island. Now. The mist still clung to the air, swirling lazily around the boat, but it wasn't as thick as before. The strange, glowing light that had haunted us for the last 2 days was nowhere to be seen. The island felt quieter, like it was waiting for me to make a choice. I didn't waste any time. I pushed the boat into the water, my hands trembling as I climbed inside and grabbed the oars, my eyes darting nervously back to the shore, half expecting to see Jack standing there, calling for me to wait, to come back. But there was nothing. Just the trees and the mist, and that ever-present feeling that something was watching me. I started rowing, my muscles aching with the effort, but I didn't care. I needed to get away, needed to put as much distance between myself and that island as I could. Every stroke of the oar felt like a struggle, like the water was fighting against me, trying to pull me back, but I kept going, refusing to stop until the shoreline was nothing more than a distant blur behind me. I didn't stop rowing until I saw the faint outline of the mainland ahead, the dark shape of the harbor growing clearer through the mist. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, lingering in the back of my mind like an echo that wouldn't fade. I don't know how long it took me to reach the harbor, but when I finally did, I barely had the strength to pull the boat onto shore. I collapsed on the dock, my body trembling from exhaustion, but I couldn't rest. Not yet. I forced myself to stand, looking back over the water one last time, half expecting to see the island still there, watching me, waiting for me to return. But there was nothing. The island was gone, hidden once again beneath the mist, like it had never existed in the first place. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened, tried to piece together the strange, impossible events that had unfolded on that island. I went back to the harbor, tried to find the island again, but no matter how far I searched, it wasn't there. I asked around, but nobody had ever heard of it, and the more I pressed, the more I started to doubt my own memories. But then there were the whispers. They never went away. Even now, when I'm alone, when the world is quiet, I can still hear them, faint but undeniable, calling to me, reminding me that the island is still out there somewhere. Jack was never found. No search party, no report, nothing. It was like he had never existed, like the island had erased him completely, and I can't help but wonder if that's what it does. Takes people, memories, everything, and swallows them whole. I think about that last moment sometimes, about the way the boat reappeared, about the way the island seemed to offer me one final chance to leave. I think about Jack, and whether I could have saved him, whether I could have done something differently. But the truth is, I don't think there was ever a way to win. The island had us the moment we set foot on it, and a part of me still wonders if I ever really left. Because every time I close my eyes, every time the world falls silent, I can still hear the whispers, calling me back. It was a late Friday evening when we finally made it to the campsite. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet forest. The rain had started earlier in the day, a light drizzle that slowly turned into a steady, rhythmic patter against the leaves above us. I remember thinking how the sound was oddly comforting. The creek, just a short walk from where we set up our tents, ran smoothly beside us, its gurgling barely audible over the rain. I had come with my two friends, Nate and Jess. We weren't experienced campers by any stretch, but we'd done this sort of thing before. Just a few friends, some beers, and a couple of nights disconnected from the world. Nothing too serious. The campsite wasn't an official one, just a spot we'd found online where people had set up before. We liked the idea of being away from the usual crowded campsites, tucked into a little clearing with the creek running nearby. It felt like we had the place all to ourselves. Nate and Jess were already unpacking, getting the tents ready, while I wandered down toward the creek just to check it out. The sound of the water mixed with the rain, creating a soothing kind of rhythm that made everything seem peaceful. But when I got closer, something about the creek looked strange. The water wasn't clear like I expected. It had this odd, murky tint to it, darker than usual, almost reddish in the fading light. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was just the way the rain was stirring up the mud or something. I wasn't too worried. Still, I stood there for a few moments, staring at the creek, wondering why it seemed different from other streams I'd seen. Eventually, I turned back toward the camp, not wanting to be the one holding things up. We had a lot of setting up to do before the rain really came down harder. Back at the campsite, Nate was complaining about the tent poles not fitting right. Jess was laughing, trying to help, but mostly just making things worse. It felt good to laugh, to be out there with friends, even with the rain starting to pick up again. We got the tents up eventually, just in time for the rain to really start pouring. By then, it was almost dark, the sky a heavy blanket of clouds, and the only light we had was from the small camp lantern we brought. The rain wasn't letting up, so we huddled under a tarp we'd strung between two trees, hoping it would hold. The conversation flowed easily, like it always did between us, but every now and then I found myself glancing toward the creek. It wasn't that I was scared or even nervous, but something about the way it had looked earlier stuck with me. Jess noticed me looking and asked if I was all right. I just nodded and said something about the water looking strange, but Nate shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the rain messing with the sediment. He was probably right, I thought. Still, as the evening went on, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was just a little off. The rain continued through the night, heavier now, beating down on the tarp we'd strung up between the trees. It was late, probably around midnight, and we were still sitting around talking and laughing, when I heard it again. The creek, the sound had changed. It wasn't the soft gurgle it had been earlier. Now it was louder, like the water was moving faster, rushing through the rocks as if something had stirred it up. I glanced toward it, trying to make out anything in the darkness, but the rain and the thickening night made it impossible to see much beyond the light of our lantern. Nate and Jess didn't seem to notice. They were caught up in some story about Nate's old college roommate, their laughter cutting through the rain, while I just kept staring in the direction of the creek. I told myself it was just the rain making the water sound different. I tried to shake it off, but it kept gnawing at me. Eventually I stood up and made my way toward the water, my footsteps muffled by the wet ground beneath me. The closer I got, the more I could hear it, rushing, almost like something was churning the water beneath the surface. When I reached the creek, I froze. The water was darker than it had been earlier. It wasn't just the usual muddy brown from the rain. It was red. Not like a slight tint from the rocks or the soil. This was a deep, unsettling red, like something had bled into the water. I leaned closer, squinting through the rain, trying to see where it was coming from, but the source wasn't clear. I stepped back, wiping the rain from my face, and turned to head back to camp, my mind racing with 1,000 explanations. Maybe it was rust from old pipes upstream, or runoff from something nearby. But then, through the steady patter of rain, I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, almost drowned out by the water, but it was there, faint and steady, coming from the creek. I stood there, listening, trying to make sense of it, but I couldn't make out any words. Just the faintest sound, like someone speaking under their breath, barely audible over the rushing water. I backed away, telling myself it was nothing, just the wind or the rain playing tricks on me. But as I made my way back to camp, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That whisper, the red water, something wasn't right. I told Nate and Jess what I saw, but they laughed it off, saying it was probably the rain messing with my head. I laughed with them, trying to brush it off, but deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong with this place. As the night wore on, I found myself glancing toward the creek more and more. Each time I could hear it, that rushing water, and just underneath it, that whisper growing louder. By the time I crawled into my tent that night, the sound of the creek was still in my head. The rain hadn't let up, now falling in heavy sheets, making it hard to sleep as it pounded against the canvas above me. Nate and Jess had passed out quickly, their soft snores barely audible over the storm, but I couldn't settle. I kept thinking about the water, how red it had looked, how that whisper seemed to rise from it, growing louder every time I got close. I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, listening to the rain, when I heard it again. The whisper. But this time it wasn't faint, it was clear, almost as if it was right outside my tent, just beyond the flaps. I sat up slowly, straining to hear. The voice was soft but steady, the words impossible to make out but unmistakably there. It was coming from the creek. For a moment I thought about waking Nate or Jess, but something about the sound pulled me in, made me feel like I needed to go check it out. I slipped on my jacket, careful not to make too much noise, and stepped out into the night. The rain was relentless, pouring down in heavy streams that soaked me instantly, but the sound of the whisper was louder now, unmistakable, calling from the direction of the creek. I walked toward it, my feet sinking into the muddy ground with each step, the cold water squelching beneath my boots. When I reached the bank, I saw it. The creek was no longer just tinted red, it was flowing like blood, thick and dark, the water swirling angrily as if something was churning it from below. And the whisper? It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were several, murmuring together, overlapping each other, like a distant chorus of voices just beneath the surface. I stepped closer, peering into the water, trying to see if there was anything beneath it, but all I could see was that endless, swirling red. Suddenly, there was movement. Something stirred in the water, and for a second I thought it was just the current shifting. But then I saw them. Figures. Rising slowly from the creek, their forms pale and barely visible through the rain. I stumbled back, heart pounding. As I watched them rise from the water, their faces blank, their bodies shimmering as though made of mist. They stood at the edge of the creek, their heads turning toward me, their mouths still moving in that endless whisper. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, watching as more figures emerged from the water, each one stepping slowly toward the bank. I don't know how long I stood there watching, but at some point I realized that the creek itself was rising. The water was swelling, pushing against the bank, flooding the ground around it, creeping toward me. I snapped out of my daze, backing away as the water rushed forward, faster now, as if it was trying to sweep me away. I turned and ran, my feet slipping in the mud, barely able to keep my balance as the water surged closer behind me. The whispers followed me, growing louder, almost angry now, as if the creek itself was calling me back. I stumbled into the camp, breathless, waking Nate and Jess with my frantic movements. They were up in seconds, confused, asking what was going on, but I couldn't explain it. I just pointed toward the creek, where the water was still rising, rushing toward us, the figures barely visible in the dark rain. Jess screamed, pulling on her jacket and grabbing her backpack, while Nate stood there, staring at the creek like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "We have to go?" I shouted, my voice barely cutting through the storm. But even as we scrambled to pack up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, that the water was still calling, waiting for us to come closer. We didn't waste any time after that. Jess was shoving things into her pack without caring what went where, her hands fumbling in the downpour. Nate still seemed frozen, his eyes locked on the rising water, but even he couldn't deny what we were seeing anymore. The creek was no longer just a creek. It was swelling, spilling over the banks, thick with that dark, unnatural red, rushing toward us like it was alive. The figures stood just beyond the water's edge, motionless but somehow moving closer with each swell of the creek. Their faces were blank, pale, their mouths still moving in unison, whispering words we couldn't understand, words we weren't meant to understand. It was like they were calling us, trying to drag us in. I grabbed Nate by the arm, shaking him out of his trance, yelling for him to pack up, to move. He snapped out of it, finally, but I could tell he was rattled, more shaken than I'd ever seen him before. None of us spoke much after that. There was no need. We all felt it. The same creeping sense that something was terribly wrong here, that we'd wandered into a place we weren't supposed to be. As I yanked my tent from the ground, I noticed something in the distance, near the far side of the creek. At first I thought it was just another one of those ghostly figures, but as I squinted through the rain, I saw something different. It was an old structure, half hidden in the darkness, barely visible through the sheets of rain. It looked like the remnants of a cabin, broken down and overgrown with moss and weeds, almost swallowed by the forest. I hadn't noticed it before, not when we first set up camp. But now, with the creek flooding and those figures rising from the water, the cabin seemed to stand out, like it had always been there, waiting to be seen. I don't know what made me do it, but I dropped my tent and started walking toward it, drawn in by something I couldn't explain. Jess called after me, asking what I was doing, but I couldn't answer her. I just kept walking, my boots sinking into the muddy ground as I made my way toward the ruins of the cabin. When I got closer, I saw it clearly. What remained of the foundation, the crumbled stone walls, the rusted tools scattered around. And then I saw the door. It was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking in the wind, but there was something about it, something that felt familiar, like I'd seen it before. I stepped inside, and immediately the air felt different. Heavy, old, like the weight of years had settled here, pressing down on everything. The whispering was louder now. We weren't planning on anything adventurous. Ben and I had just wanted a weekend away from work, something easy and laid back. You know, the usual camping trip with a fire, maybe a few beers, and the kind of silence that only comes when you're far away from traffic and phone signals. Ben had heard about this place, a quiet spot near some hiking trails, not too far from a cave that people seem to avoid. He mentioned it casually while we were driving up there. I didn't think much of it at the time. The rain started just as we pulled off the main road. It wasn't heavy, but steady enough to cast a grayness over the landscape that made everything seem a little more distant. The trees on either side of the gravel path looked darker, the leaves heavy with water, the ground slightly slick beneath the tires. Ben laughed, something about it not being a real camping trip without a little rain. I nodded, staring out the window as the world passed by in a blur of green and gray, my thoughts already wandering toward the idea of a campfire and the smell of smoke. By the time we reached the clearing, the rain had settled into a drizzle, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ben got out of the car first, stretching like we'd just driven across the country, even though it had only been a few hours. The air smelled damp, earthy, with that faint hint of pine and wet leaves that always seems more intense after it rains. I stepped out too, feeling the mist on my face, and looked around the clearing. It was quiet, except for the occasional drip of water from the branches. A narrow trail led off into the trees, barely visible from where we parked, winding its way toward the cave Ben had mentioned. "You want to check it out later?" he asked, grinning like we were still in high school, up to no good. "Maybe," I replied, not really feeling the same enthusiasm, but curious enough to go along with it. We set up camp quickly, our tent pitched near the edge of the clearing, the ground surprisingly dry considering the rain. It was still early in the evening, but the sky had that dull gray glow that made it feel like night would fall at any moment. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting something to move, even though I knew we were alone. Or, at least, I assumed we were. We sat around the fire later that evening, watching the flames flicker as the rain picked up again, just enough to make a soft pattering against the tent and the trees. Ben was talking about some hike we could do tomorrow, but I kept finding myself distracted by the sound of the rain and the forest around us. It was peaceful at first, the kind of quiet you don't get in a city, but after a while, I started noticing something strange. There was this other sound, beneath the rain, so faint I wasn't even sure it was real. At first, I thought it was the wind coming through the trees, a soft, rhythmic rush, like the forest was breathing. I didn't say anything, figured I was just overthinking it, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't coming from the wind or the trees. It was deeper, almost like it was coming from the earth itself, from the direction of the cave. Ben must have noticed the look on my face because he stopped mid-sentence and asked, "What's up?" I shrugged it off, tried to laugh, but it didn't feel natural. "I think I hear something," I said finally, not wanting to sound paranoid but unable to ignore it any longer. He cocked his head to the side, listening for a minute, then smiled. "It's probably just the wind in the cave," he said, waving it off like it was nothing. But even as he said it, I could tell he was curious too. After a while, we both fell silent, listening. That soft, rhythmic sound, it was still there, like the cave was alive, breathing, drawing us in. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, and the longer we sat there, the harder it became to ignore. "We should check it out tomorrow," Ben said after a long pause, but his voice wasn't as confident as it had been earlier. I didn't respond right away, just kept staring at the dark line of trees that led toward the cave. There was something off about it, something that made the back of my mind itch, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The rain continued to fall, and the sound, that deep, rhythmic exhale, kept going. I wanted to brush it off, to blame it on the wind or the rain or anything else, but part of me knew it wasn't any of those things. We eventually went to bed, but I didn't sleep much. That sound was still there, just under the surface, and every time I closed my eyes, I swore it was getting louder. The next morning, the rain had let up, but the sky was still thick with clouds, casting a dull, gray light over everything. Neither of us talked much over breakfast. Ben, usually chatty in the mornings, seemed preoccupied, his eyes constantly drifting toward the trail leading to the cave. I didn't bring it up, but it was clear we were both thinking about the same thing. That strange, rhythmic sound from the night before. It had faded as dawn broke, but the memory of it lingered, like an itch at the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. Finally, Ben stood up, brushing the crumbs off his hands, and said, "Let's check it out. No point in sitting around here all day, right?" I nodded, more out of obligation than excitement, but deep down I was curious too. We packed some water, put on our jackets, and set off down the trail, the wet ground soft beneath our boots. The trees closed in around us as we walked, the branches hanging heavy with moisture, dripping every so often onto the trail. The deeper we went, the quieter everything seemed to get, until the only sound left was the occasional shuffle of our feet and the distant drip of water. After a while we reached a small clearing, and there it was, the cave. It wasn't much to look at, just a dark opening in the side of a rocky hill, overgrown with moss and vines, like it hadn't been touched in years. But standing there, staring into that blackness, I felt something shift inside me. I glanced over at Ben, who was already moving toward the entrance, more eager than I expected him to be. "Come on," he called back, his voice echoing slightly as he stepped into the mouth of the cave. I hesitated for a second, my feet feeling heavy, like they didn't want to move. But I followed, feeling an odd pull, as if the cave itself was drawing me in. Inside, the air was cooler, damper, and that strange, rhythmic sound we'd heard last night. It was back. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, a soft, almost human exhale, like something deep within the cave was breathing. Ben glanced around, shining his flashlight along the walls, and that's when we saw it. Old climbing gear, scattered near the entrance, rusted and frayed, like it had been there for decades. "Looks like someone left in a hurry," Ben muttered, kicking at the remnants of a tattered rope with the toe of his boot. I crouched down, picking up what looked like a piece of an old carabiner, the metal cold and brittle in my hand. "Think it belonged to those explorers?" I asked, referring to the story we'd heard about a group that had gone missing near this cave years ago. Ben didn't answer. He was too focused on the dark passage ahead, where the walls narrowed and curved, disappearing into the deeper parts of the cave. The breathing sound grew louder the further we went, each step feeling heavier than the last, like something was weighing us down. The air felt thick, damp, almost suffocating, and every breath we took seemed to echo in the silence. I wanted to say something, to tell Ben we should turn back, but the words stuck in my throat. He kept moving forward, his light bouncing off the rough stone walls, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance in the darkness. Then we saw it, bones. Not many, just a few scattered near the edge of a drop-off where the cave floor seemed to give way into a pit. I froze, my flashlight trembling as it illuminated what looked like a human skull, half buried in the dirt, cracked and yellowed with age. Ben took a step closer, peering over the edge, and that's when the ground shifted beneath us, a low rumble vibrating through the cave. The breathing sound, the cave exhaling, grew louder, more urgent, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but Ben was already too far ahead, staring down into the darkness. Before I could stop him, he slipped, his foot catching on a loose rock, and he tumbled forward, vanishing over the edge. I rushed to the edge, where Ben had fallen, heart hammering in my chest as I pointed my flashlight down into the pit. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing jagged rocks below, but no sign of Ben. "Ben!" I shouted, my voice echoing back at me, swallowed by the cave's deep, rhythmic exhale. For a moment, I didn't know what to do, just stood there staring down into that black void, the sound of the cave's breathing growing louder, almost like it was alive. Then, to my relief, I heard Ben groan. His voice was faint, but it was there, coming from a narrow ledge about 10 feet down, just out of my line of sight. I shone the flashlight toward the ledge, and there he was, lying on his side, gripping his arm. "I'm okay," he called up weakly, his voice shaky. "Just banged up. I think I can climb out." I exhaled sharply, but something wasn't right. The breathing sound, it wasn't just coming from the cave anymore. It felt closer, like it was wrapping itself around us, pulling us in. As Ben slowly tried to pull himself up, the air seemed to grow heavier, and I could feel that strange pull again, like the cave wanted to swallow us whole. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to help him, but every thought felt sluggish, clouded by the deep, rhythmic exhale. "Hang on. I'll find a rope," I shouted, spinning around to look for something, anything to help him climb up. That's when I noticed something. The old climbing gear scattered around the entrance wasn't just abandoned. It looked like it had been left in a hurry. Tattered ropes, rusted carabiners, broken harnesses. It was all there, but none of it looked like it had been used in years. And then it hit me. The stories. The explorers who had gone missing. They hadn't just disappeared. They'd been claimed by the cave, drawn in by that same breathing sound, that same pull that was trying to drag us in now. I stumbled back to the edge, shining my flashlight down again. Ben was still struggling to pull himself up, his movements slow and strained, as if the air itself was pressing down on him. The breathing sound was louder now, almost deafening, and with every exhale, the walls seemed to tremble, shifting ever so slightly. "Ben, we need to get out of here," I called down, trying to keep my voice steady, but the panic was creeping in. "I know," he snapped back, trying to grip the rocks, but every time he reached for a hold, the stone seemed to crumble beneath his fingers. It was like the cave itself was alive, fighting back, resisting any attempt to escape. I dropped to my knees, reaching down as far as I could, but the ledge was just out of reach. Every second felt like an eternity. The cave's exhale growing more intense, the air pressing in around us, thick and suffocating. And then, just when it seemed like Ben was about to give up, his hand found a hold and he started to climb. I reached down, grabbing his arm as he struggled up the last few feet, pulling him onto solid ground. We collapsed there for a moment, gasping for air, but the cave wouldn't stop. The breathing, it was still there, still pulling at us, like it wasn't ready to let us go. I knew then that whatever had taken those explorers, whatever had claimed their lives, was still here. And it wanted us too. Without a word, we scrambled to our feet and ran, not daring to look back as the cave's exhale followed us out. We didn't stop running until we were back at camp, our legs burning, lungs aching, but all I could focus on was the sound of that cave still echoing in my mind. Ben didn't say a word as he grabbed his things, stuffing them haphazardly into his bag. I did the same, both of us moving on autopilot, desperate to leave. The rain had started again, light at first, but it quickly turned into a steady downpour as we drove away, the trees and trail disappearing behind us like they were part of some forgotten dream. We never talked about it after that. Not really, just the occasional mention of that trip and a quick change of subject. But every once in a while when I'm alone, I still hear it. That slow, rhythmic exhale. Like the cave is waiting, breathing, and remembering us. It started with an idea that seemed simple enough. My friend Mike had stumbled upon a hiking blog late one night, the kind where the trails mentioned were barely known, lost to time and curiosity. He sent me the link, saying this looks epic, and I clicked on it out of boredom, more than anything. The article described a mountain, remote and untouched by modern life, a place so isolated that no tourists dared to venture there. No cell service, no markers, just raw nature with the kind of silence you couldn't find anywhere else. I'm not usually one to jump at camping trips, especially not off the grid like that. But something about the idea tugged at me. Maybe it was the months of work grinding me down, or maybe it was the thought of getting away from everything, if only for a weekend. Josh was quick to agree too, claiming he could use some quiet, and before I knew it, the three of us were packed and ready for the trip. It was October, not yet freezing, but the forecast hinted at rain, which didn't seem like a big deal at the time. We figured we'd tough it out. We left early, the drive taking us deep into the mountains, past towns I'd never even heard of, and the roads grew narrower with each mile. Mike was behind the wheel talking about how this place had a strange history, something about a tribe that had once lived on the mountain and mysteriously disappeared centuries ago. I didn't pay much attention to it at first, chalking it up to one of those exaggerated campfire legends people love to tell. Josh laughed it off, saying every remote place had a story like that. We drove for hours, the scenery shifting from scattered towns to dense forests and rocky terrain. By the time we arrived at the base of the mountain, it was already late afternoon, the sun hanging low behind a thick curtain of clouds. We parked, unloaded our gear, and started the hike up. The trail wasn't marked like we expected, just a faint path cutting through the trees, overgrown in places like no one had walked it in years. It was quiet, unnervingly quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in the city when things slow down, but the kind where everything around you feels still, waiting. We trekked up for hours, and with each step I felt the mountain grow more imposing. It was steep, rugged, and as we climbed higher, the trees began to thin out, revealing jagged rocks and cliff faces towering above us. The path twisted and turned, and we followed it without question, trusting Mike's directions, even though the trail seemed to get narrower the further we went. We stopped for a breather near a large rock outcrop, where strange carvings caught my eye, etched deep into the stone, weathered but unmistakable. They weren't random marks, they looked deliberate, ancient even, like symbols left behind by someone, or something. I pointed them out to Mike, but he just shrugged, saying they were probably from some early settlers or hikers who'd passed through ages ago. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were older, much older than that. Josh took a quick photo with his phone, saying we could look it up later, but none of us lingered there for long. We pushed on, the path growing more treacherous as the daylight faded into early evening and the clouds above us thickened. It wasn't long before we found a decent spot to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines with just enough space for our tents. The three of us worked in silence, setting up our gear, the only sound being the distant rustling of wind through the trees. By the time we finished, darkness had fully settled in, and an uneasy calm had taken over the mountain. We built a small fire, the flames flickering weakly against the cool, damp air as we sat around it, trying to relax, but it didn't feel quite right. There was something about the mountain, the way it loomed over us, the carvings, the silence, that gnawed at me. Mike tried to break the tension, joking about how we'd finally found a place so remote that not even mosquitoes would bother us. But the joke fell flat. The rain began to fall lightly, a steady drizzle tapping against our tents and soaking into the ground. We ate in relative quiet, our conversation thinning out as the night grew heavier. I glanced at the rock outcrop we passed earlier, wondering about those carvings, about who or what had made them. The rain picked up, heavier now, the fire sputtering out as we called it a night, retreating to our tents. Lying there, I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Not just with the mountain, but with the way the air felt, thick and heavy, like the mountain itself was watching us. And then, just as I began to drift off, I heard it. A low, steady rhythm, faint at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the rain. Drums. The next morning, the rain hadn't let up. It wasn't a downpour, but a constant drizzle, the kind that soaked into everything, making the trail slippery and the air cold. Mike was already up, packing his gear, his usual energy dulled by the dreary weather, but still determined to hike further up the mountain. Josh, on the other hand, looked less enthusiastic, though he didn't say anything as he rolled up his damp sleeping bag and stuffed it into his pack. None of us mentioned the drums I heard last night. Part of me thought I had imagined it, maybe some distant thunder or the wind playing tricks, but it stayed in the back of my mind, nagging at me. We packed up camp, deciding to continue up the trail in search of a better spot to explore. Maybe even something with a decent view once the clouds cleared. As we hiked, I found myself looking at the trees more closely, the way they stood unnaturally still, not even swaying despite the occasional gust of wind. The trail itself seemed more overgrown than yesterday, the foliage thicker, the branches hanging lower, forcing us to duck beneath them more often. The higher we went, the narrower the path became, until it was more like a faint outline in the earth than a real trail. It felt like we were walking deeper into the mountain itself, like the trees were closing in on us. After a couple of hours, we came across more of those carvings. This time, they weren't just on one rock, but scattered across several boulders lining the path, each more detailed than the last. The same jagged circular symbols from before, but now mixed with other shapes, figures almost human-like yet distorted, elongated. I stopped to get a closer look, running my hand over the cold, wet stone, tracing the lines of one of the symbols. It felt wrong somehow, like it didn't belong there, like it had been left as a warning. Mike, ever the adventurer, snapped a few photos, saying we should research it when we got back. But I wasn't sure we should be messing with them. Josh, who had been unusually quiet since we started hiking, muttered something under his breath about how the whole place was starting to give him the creeps. I agreed silently, but none of us said anything more as we continued on. The drizzling rain muting our footsteps, making everything around us feel damp and distant. The trail grew steeper, and soon we were climbing more than hiking, pulling ourselves up by roots and rocks as we ascended further into the thickening forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Several times, I stopped to listen, thinking I heard faint footsteps behind us, only to turn and find nothing but the rain and mist swirling through the trees. It was like the mountain itself was watching us, following us, waiting for something. Mike and Josh seemed unfazed, pushing ahead, but I started noticing the same symbol over and over again, carved into the trees this time. It was everywhere, repeating in a way that felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. We finally reached a small clearing, not large enough to camp in, but just big enough for a brief rest. There was a rock in the center, smoother than the others, with deep, jagged carvings etched across its surface. It looked like a map, or maybe a story, one that I couldn't understand, but it gave me the distinct feeling that something terrible had happened here long ago. Josh dropped his pack and leaned against a tree, rubbing his eyes, looking as tired as I felt. Mike, ever the optimist, said we should keep moving, that we were getting close to the ridge where we'd find the view he'd been talking about. But I wasn't so sure I wanted to keep going. As we rested, the rain picked up again, heavier this time, and for a moment, I thought I heard the faint echo of drums in the distance. I glanced at Mike and Josh to see if they heard it too, but neither of them reacted. Maybe it was just the rain, I told myself. But the sound was there, unmistakable, a slow, rhythmic beat that seemed to pulse through the air, growing louder with each passing minute. I stood up, suddenly feeling an overwhelming urge to move, to keep going, to get off that mountain before something happened. Mike laughed, telling me I was just getting spooked by the weather, but even Josh looked uneasy as he pulled his jacket tighter around himself. We pressed on, the path narrowing even more, the trees crowding us from all sides, their branches thick with moss and dripping rainwater. And then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, we saw them. Figures, standing on the ridge above us, silhouetted against the misty sky, motionless, watching. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figures on the ridge were so still, almost blending into the trees, that I wasn't sure if they were real or just shadows cast by the uneven terrain. But as I blinked and wiped the rain from my face, I realized they were real. They stood there, unmoving, like sentinels watching us from above, their shapes just barely visible through the mist and drizzle. I tried to make sense of it, telling myself it was probably just other hikers who had found a shortcut up the ridge. But something about the way they stood there felt wrong. Mike had stopped too, his cheerful attitude fading as he stared up at the ridge. Josh muttered something, his voice low, as if he didn't want to be heard, but I caught enough of it to know he was feeling the same creeping unease. We were all frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The figures didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. I strained my eyes, trying to get a clearer look, but the mist was thickening, and the rain was making it harder to see. That's when I noticed something strange. Their eyes. I could barely make them out, but there was something about the way their eyes reflected the light, even in the dim, rain-soaked evening. They weren't normal. They glowed, faintly at first, but then brighter, like embers in the dark, staring down at us with a cold, inhuman intensity. A chill ran through me, though I told myself it was just the damp cold seeping into my bones. Mike was the first to break the silence, his voice unsteady as he called out to them. "Hey, you guys lost too?" he shouted, trying to keep it casual, like we hadn't just stumbled across something that felt deeply unnatural. There was no response. The figures didn't flinch, didn't react in any way, as if they hadn't heard him, or as if they didn't care. Josh took a step back, clearly unnerved, and I couldn't blame him. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn around, to get off that mountain, to leave whatever this was far behind us. But Mike, ever the skeptic, shrugged and muttered something about locals playing tricks on us. He said it with a weak grin, but I could tell he wasn't as confident as he was pretending to be. "Let's keep moving," he said, motioning for us to follow the trail. I hesitated, not sure if I wanted to go any further, but the alternative, staying there under the gaze of those eerie figures, felt worse. Reluctantly, we started walking again, though none of us spoke, our eyes flicking back to the ridge every few seconds. The figures didn't move, but they were still watching, their glowing eyes fixed on us as we continued up the trail. The path grew steeper, more uneven, and the rain made it harder to climb, but we kept pushing forward, trying to put distance between us and whatever was on that ridge. It wasn't long before the drumming started again. This time, it was louder, more distinct, the steady beat echoing through the trees around us, matching the rhythm of our footsteps. Josh was breathing heavily now, his nerves clearly fraying, and I wasn't far behind him. The sound of the drums seemed to be coming from all directions, and no matter how fast we walked, they followed us, growing louder with each step. I glanced back again just to be sure, and that's when I saw them. The figures had moved. They were closer now, no longer standing on the ridge, but down among the trees, moving silently through the forest, their glowing eyes cutting through the mist like lanterns. I grabbed Mike's arm, my voice low but urgent as I told him to look. His face paled when he saw them, and for once, he didn't have anything to say. We picked up the pace, almost jogging now, our boots slipping on the wet ground as the trail wound its way up the mountain. But no matter how fast we went, the figures stayed with us, always just out of reach, always watching. The drumming grew louder, faster, like the beating of a heart, pounding in rhythm with our footsteps. I could feel the pressure building, the weight of something unseen bearing down on us as we struggled to climb higher, the rain turning into a steady downpour. The sky was darkening quickly, and soon it would be night. But the thought of stopping, of camping out again on this cursed mountain, was unthinkable. We had to keep moving, had to find a way off the mountain before whatever was following us caught up. Mike was ahead of me now, his usual bravado gone as he led the way, his eyes scanning the trail ahead for any sign of a way down. Josh was lagging behind, his breathing ragged, and I called out to him, telling him to hurry up. But then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from somewhere in the trees behind us. I turned, and that's when I saw them, the figures emerging from the mist, their eyes burning bright in the darkness, their bodies thin and twisted, like shadows made flesh. They were closer now, moving toward us with a deliberate, predatory grace, their glowing eyes locked on us. I yelled for Mike to run, and without thinking, we broke into a full sprint, the trail disappearing beneath our feet as we tore through the forest, slipping and stumbling in the rain. The drumming was deafening now, pounding in my ears, driving us forward as we fled from the figures, their glowing eyes the only thing I could see in the growing darkness. They were getting closer, and I knew, without a doubt, that if they caught us, we wouldn't be leaving this mountain. We ran blindly through the forest, the trail long forgotten beneath our feet. The rain poured down in sheets, soaking us to the bone, turning the ground into a slick mess of mud and leaves. I could barely see ahead, the thick mist and the growing darkness swallowing everything around us. But the one thing I could see, the one thing I couldn't stop seeing, were those glowing eyes in the distance behind us. The drumming pounded louder, its rhythm erratic now, faster, more desperate, as if it were pushing us toward something. I didn't know where we were going, and neither did Mike or Josh. We just knew we had to keep running, had to stay ahead of whatever was following us. Those figures whose presence seemed less human with every passing second. As we dashed through the trees, slipping and tripping over roots and rocks, I began to piece together what little I knew about this mountain. Mike had mentioned it earlier, something about a tribe that used to live here, long before the settlers arrived. They were said to have disappeared without a trace, leaving only their strange carvings behind, the same carvings we'd seen all over the rocks and trees. It was supposed to be just a story, a legend, but now, with those figures closing in, it felt like something much more sinister. I didn't know what had happened to the tribe, but I had a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't natural. Maybe they hadn't disappeared after all. Maybe they were still here, cursed to roam the mountain, waiting for something or someone to cross their path. And now that we had, they weren't going to let us leave. We kept running, our lungs burning, our legs aching from the relentless pace, but the drumming never stopped. It seemed to follow us, reverberating through the trees, through the earth beneath our feet, as if the mountain itself was alive and pushing us forward. Every so often, I'd glance back, hoping, praying, that the figures would be gone. But they were always there, just at the edge of the mist, their glowing eyes never wavering. The rain only made it worse, the relentless downpour muffling everything except for the drums and the sound of our own frantic breaths. And then, just when I thought we couldn't run any farther, we came to a dead end. A cliff. The forest had opened up suddenly, and we found ourselves standing at the edge of a steep drop, the ground falling away beneath us into a dark abyss. There was no way forward. We had run out of trail, out of options. Mike stopped first, staring at the drop-off in disbelief, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Josh stumbled up behind us, collapsing to his knees, his face pale and wet, his hands shaking as he looked out over the cliff. "We're trapped," he whispered, and I could hear the fear in his voice, the raw panic that I had been feeling for miles now. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. The drumming hadn't stopped. In fact, it was louder now, almost deafening, like it was coming from all around us. And when I turned to look back the way we had come, my heart sank. The figures were closer than ever, emerging from the trees one by one, their glowing eyes fixed on us, their movements slow, deliberate. There was something about the way they moved, something unnatural, like they weren't walking at all, but gliding through the mist, silent except for the beating of the drums. They were closing in, cutting off our escape, pushing us toward the edge of the cliff. We had nowhere to go. Mike was muttering to himself, trying to think of a plan. But there was no plan, no way out of this. I could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on us, the ancient power of whatever was lurking here, the remnants of that lost tribe. They were here, in front of us, their glowing eyes burning brighter with each step. Josh was the first to panic. He stood up, backing away from the cliff, his eyes wide, his breathing ragged. "I can't do this," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the rain and the drums. He turned to run, but before he could take more than a few steps, one of the figures moved. It was so fast, faster than I thought possible. One moment it was standing at the edge of the clearing, the next it was right behind Josh, its thin, shadowy hand reaching out toward him. Josh let out a strangled cry as the figure grabbed him, its glowing eyes burning into his as it pulled him back toward the trees. I moved without thinking, lunging forward to grab him, but Mike held me back, his grip tight on my arm. "We can't," he whispered, his voice hollow, broken. Josh was gone. Dragged into the mist, into the trees, his screams swallowed by the relentless pounding of the drums. We were alone now, just the two of us. The figures were still there, their glowing eyes fixed on us as they closed the distance, inch by inch. Mike looked at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to jump," he said, his voice trembling. I looked at him, then at the cliff, then back at the figures. He was right. There was no other choice. Whatever these things were, whatever they wanted, we weren't going to survive if we stayed. Without another word, we backed up to the edge of the cliff, the cold wind whipping at our faces, the drums pounding in our ears, the figures closing in. And then, together, we jumped. The fall was longer than I expected, the wind howling in my ears as we tumbled into the darkness below. I hit the ground hard, my body crashing through brush and loose rocks before finally coming to a stop. For a long moment, I lay there, dazed, rain still falling in steady sheets around me. Mike landed a few feet away, groaning in pain but alive. We were battered, bruised, but somehow we had survived the jump. The drumming had stopped. I didn't know if we had escaped them, or if they had simply let us go. Either way, the eerie silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the sound of the drums had been. We didn't speak much as we made our way down the mountain, stumbling through the rain and mist, half blind and utterly exhausted. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at us, but the figures were gone. We didn't stop until we reached the base, where the car was still waiting, untouched, as if nothing had happened. The drive home was a blur. Josh's absence hung in the air between us, a heavy, unspoken weight that neither of us could bear to mention. Weeks later, I tried to make sense of what we'd experienced, but there was nothing to explain it. No record of the tribe, no stories, nothing. Mike refused to talk about it after that night. We haven't spoken since. And every now and then, when the rain starts falling late at night, I swear I can still hear the faint echo of those drums. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a chance to disconnect, recharge, and spend some time hiking through the trails I'd read about online. Nothing too ambitious, just a solo trip in a national park I'd always meant to visit. The drive-in had been uneventful, the weather promising, and as I parked my car at the trailhead that afternoon, I felt confident that the hike would go as smoothly as planned. I had checked the forecast more times than I could count, and everything pointed to clear skies for the next 2 days. It was perfect. I set off on the trail, feeling the familiar crunch of dirt beneath my boots, the sun filtering through the trees above, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The wind was gentle, and everything seemed to align, the kind of peace you rarely get in the day-to-day grind. I couldn't help but take out my phone and snap a few pictures, thinking how great this would look later after the hike, when I could show friends the serene beauty of the forest. The trail itself was easy to follow, well marked, with nothing but nature for miles in every direction. About 2 hours in, though, the first signs of trouble began to show themselves. I noticed that the wind had picked up slightly, not in a way that alarmed me, but enough that I had to zip up my jacket. The sky above, which had been a vivid blue when I started out, now carried a few more clouds than I remembered. Still, it seemed nothing out of the ordinary, just the natural shift of weather that happens in any forest. But then, something else started to nag at me. The forest had gotten quieter. Not just the kind of quiet you expect when you're deep in the woods. This felt different, like the usual chatter of birds and the occasional rustle in the bushes had simply stopped. I slowed down, half listening, wondering if I was imagining it, or if the animals had sensed something I couldn't. A sudden gust of wind pushed against me, and I stumbled a bit, bracing myself as leaves whipped past, tugging at my clothing. I glanced at the clouds again, and this time they seemed darker, gathering quickly in the sky as if someone had painted a smear of gray across what had been clear moments before. Still, I didn't think much of it. Storms blow in and out of mountains all the time, right? I quickened my pace, not so much because I was worried, but because I had hoped to reach a scenic overlook before sunset, and I wanted to be back at my campsite before the rain, if any, started to fall. The trail was starting to narrow, with the trees on either side growing thicker, their branches intertwining above me in a web-like canopy that blocked out more of the fading light. That's when I first heard it, the distant rumble of thunder, low and far off, but unmistakable. I checked my phone, not for the time, but for the weather again, just to be sure I hadn't missed something earlier. No service. Typical, I thought, grumbling to myself, but I didn't feel panicked. Not yet, anyway. I was prepared. Had my gear, had a map, knew where the nearest campsites were. In worst case, I just waited out until the rain passed. As the minutes dragged on, though, the storm seemed to be moving faster than I anticipated. The wind was stronger now, almost constant, and it was getting harder to hear anything over the steady sound of it rushing through the trees. The first raindrop hit me square on the cheek, cold and sharp, just as I felt a chill roll through the air. I stopped for a moment, pulling my hood up and glancing around the forest. The light was fading fast, and I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I needed to move faster. I couldn't explain why, but something about the way the storm was developing didn't sit right with me. There had been no warning, no gradual buildup. It was as if someone had flicked a switch and unleashed it all at once. Another crack of thunder echoed overhead, closer now, followed by a second drop, and then a third. The rain started coming down hard, heavy sheets that pelted me relentlessly. I picked up my pace, eyes scanning the trees for any sign of shelter, cursing myself for not being more prepared. That's when I saw it, off the trail a bit, barely visible through the growing darkness and rain. A small wooden cabin, sitting there, tucked away like it had been forgotten by time. I hesitated for only a second before making my way toward it, the storm now too intense to keep moving along the trail without getting soaked through. It wasn't on any map I had seen, but then again, I hadn't been hiking this trail enough to know every detail. I figured it was an old shelter, left behind by rangers or other hikers who had been caught in storms like this before. The wind pushed me forward, and I reached the door, my fingers fumbling for the handle as rain streamed down my face. The door groaned as I opened it, and I stepped inside, grateful for the sudden relief from the elements. But the moment I crossed the threshold, something felt off. I couldn't pinpoint it right away. Maybe it was just the sudden contrast between the howling storm outside and the dead stillness inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something earthy and old. I took a few steps in, the floor creaking under my boots, and looked around. The cabin was small, just one room with a sagging table in the middle and a few scattered items left behind by someone who had been here before me. An old canteen, a rusted knife, and a camping stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it was the walls that caught my attention next. Long, jagged scratches ran across the wooden beams, crisscrossing in random directions, deep enough that I could fit my fingers into them. I frowned, stepping closer to get a better look, trying to figure out what could have caused them. It wasn't normal wear and tear, that much was obvious, but what animal or person could have done that? Before I could think too much about it, another crack of thunder split the air, followed by the sound of rain hammering down harder than before. I shook off the unease and turned my attention back to the door, thinking I'd wait it out here until the storm passed. But as I stood there, listening to the wind whip around the cabin, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. Something about the scratches, the abandoned gear, and the thick, musty air made me uneasy, even though I couldn't explain why. The rain pounded against the roof, and I looked up, noticing for the first time that the ceiling didn't seem entirely stable. It sagged in places, and with the storm raging outside, I wondered how long it would hold. I told myself I was just overthinking things, that it was just an old cabin, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right, and I wasn't sure how long I'd be safe in here. The rain battered the cabin relentlessly, each drop sounding like a drumbeat on the roof. Inside, it was as though I'd stepped into a different world altogether, a world forgotten by time, where the storm outside barely seemed real anymore, save for the steady thrum of water against wood. I moved toward the window, peering through the fogged glass, hoping to catch some sign that the storm might be letting up. Instead, the scene outside looked even more uninviting than before. The sky had darkened to a deep, inky black, swallowing up the last remnants of daylight in a way that felt unnatural. It wasn't just evening anymore, it looked like the dead of night, though I knew it wasn't even close to sunset yet. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong, but I brushed it off, telling myself the storm had simply come on stronger than expected. After all, storms had a way of rolling through the mountains like that. Quick, intense, and gone just as fast. I turned back to the cabin, taking in my surroundings more carefully now. The scratches on the walls, those deep, jagged gouges, stood out in sharp relief against the darkened wood, crisscrossing in patterns that seemed deliberate. They were too large, too precise, to be from any animal I could think of. My mind raced through the possibilities. Bears, maybe? But no, the scratches were too high, too strange, like something had been desperate to escape, or to get in. That thought lingered in my mind longer than I wanted it to, and I moved toward the door to check the lock. Not that it gave me any comfort. The cabin was old, and the door looked flimsy at best. One good shove and it would probably splinter apart. But I bolted it anyway, if only to feel like I was doing something. The storm wasn't slowing down. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. Thunder rumbled again, this time much closer, shaking the floor beneath me with its intensity. I felt the walls of the cabin tremble slightly, the wind whistling through the small cracks in the wood, causing the room to fill with a low, eerie hum. I thought about heading back out, but the rain was coming down in torrents now, and the idea of venturing back onto the trail seemed reckless. There was no telling how far the next campsite was, and I had no desire to get lost or risk injury. I figured I was better off staying put for the time being. I wandered over to the small table in the center of the room, my eyes falling on the old canteen and the rusted camping stove. There was something unsettling about the way they were just left there, abandoned mid-use, as if whoever had been here before me had left in a hurry. I picked up the canteen, shaking it gently. It was empty, the faint rattle of the cap echoing hollowly through the room. Next to it, something else caught my eye, a small, leather-bound journal, the edges curled and the pages yellowed with age. I flipped it open, not really expecting much, but what I found made my stomach turn. The entries were sparse, written in a messy scrawl, with no dates to indicate when they'd been made, but the last few pages told a story that was disturbingly familiar. The writer described hiking in the very same area, caught in a storm that had appeared out of nowhere, just like the one outside now. They talked about finding the cabin, seeking shelter, just as I had, but as I read on, the tone of the writing changed. It grew frantic, disjointed, the words becoming harder to make out, as though the writer had been in a hurry, or worse, terrified. The last few pages were particularly unsettling, detailing strange noises outside the cabin, scratching sounds, the sense of being watched. The final entry ended abruptly, the last line trailing off into a jagged scrawl, leaving whatever thought the writer had unfinished. I stared at the journal for a long moment, the unease I'd been feeling since I entered the cabin growing more intense. What had happened to them? Where had they gone? I turned the journal over in my hands, looking for any clue, but it offered none. Had they made it out? Or were they still out there somewhere, in the storm? I set the journal down, the questions it raised hanging heavy in the air, and moved to the window again. The rain was relentless, pounding against the glass with a force that made it impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the cabin's walls. But there was something else, too. Something in the darkness, just at the edge of where the trees met the clearing. A shape. It was hard to make out through the rain and the fading light, but it was there, unmoving, like a shadow barely distinguishable from the trunks of the trees around it. I blinked, thinking maybe it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps my eyes were playing tricks on me after being in the dim interior of the cabin for so long. But when I looked again, the shape hadn't moved. I leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look, but just as I did, the wind howled louder than before, shaking the walls of the cabin. The window rattled in its frame, and for a brief moment, I thought it might shatter. I stepped back, my heart thudding in my chest, but when I looked again, the shape was gone. It was as if it had never been there in the first place, swallowed by the storm and the thick curtain of rain. I turned away from the window, my mind racing through possibilities, but none of them made sense. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just a tree or a bush caught in the flicker of lightning. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I busied myself with the items in the cabin, checking my pack, hoping the storm would pass quickly. But the longer I stayed in the small, dim space, the more it began to feel like I was trapped in a place I didn't belong. The wind outside picked up again, sending gusts through the cracks in the walls, and as I settled down on the bench near the table, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I thought about the journal, the scratches on the walls, and the strange shape I'd seen outside. Were they connected? Had the writer seen the same thing before they vanished? I didn't want to stay in the cabin any longer than necessary, but with the storm raging outside, I didn't have much choice. The roof creaked overhead, the wind pushing against the structure with renewed force, and I glanced up, half expecting to see it give way at any moment. I wondered how long it had been since anyone had stepped foot in here. Years, maybe decades. Yet there were signs that someone had been here recently, and that thought alone was enough to keep me on edge. The wind howled again, and for a moment I thought I heard something else. Something softer, more deliberate, like footsteps just outside the door. I waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if the storm had gotten inside my head, but either way, I couldn't shake the growing sense that I wasn't alone in that cabin, and the storm wasn't the only thing keeping me there. The storm didn't ease up. If anything, it grew stronger by the minute, as if it had some kind of deliberate force behind it, pushing it to intensify. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a regular mountain storm. It was too aggressive, too sudden, and too strange. I had been in storms before, plenty of times while hiking, but nothing like this. Nothing that seemed to surround me so completely, isolating me from everything outside that small cabin. The walls rattled with every gust of wind, and the roof, which had looked fragile from the moment I stepped inside, began to creak more ominously. I caught myself glancing upward every few seconds, wondering if it would hold. The rain lashed against the windows, a constant hammering sound that made it impossible to hear anything beyond the storm. Even so, the silence inside the cabin felt heavier, thicker somehow. I paced the room, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to stay here, not with the roof threatening to cave in and whatever strange presence seemed to be lurking outside. But I also knew that stepping out into the storm wasn't an option. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the trail would be slippery and dangerous by now. I sat down at the rickety old table, resting my head in my hands, and tried to think. There was something about this place that was gnawing at me, something I couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just the storm, or the scratches on the walls, or even the journal I'd found. It was the way the air felt, as if the cabin was holding on to secrets I wasn't supposed to uncover. I glanced at the journal again, still lying where I'd left it on the table. The words from the last entry swirled in my mind, half-forgotten phrases of fear and desperation. Whoever had been here before me had felt it too, this creeping unease, this sense that something was very, very wrong. I got up, restless, and walked over to the window again, wiping away the condensation that had fogged up the glass. The rain made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet outside, but I scanned the edge of the forest, looking for any sign of movement. That shape I'd seen earlier, it had been too distinct to be nothing. My breath fogged the window again, and I wiped it away impatiently. Was it still out there, just beyond my line of sight, waiting for me to step outside? I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't the only thing trying to keep me trapped in here. I moved back toward the door, my hand hovering over the latch. Part of me wanted to open it, just for a second, just to see what was out there. But another part of me, maybe the smarter part, told me that opening that door would be a mistake. A crack of thunder shook the cabin again, followed by a flash of lightning that lit up the room for a brief moment. In that instant, I saw something, or thought I did, just outside the window, a shadow that flickered and then disappeared in the blink of an eye. I froze, staring at the window, waiting for the lightning to strike again, for the storm to illuminate the outside world one more time. But the next flash came and went, and there was nothing. Just the rain, the wind, and the trees swaying violently in the storm. I turned away, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I really seen something? Or was it just my imagination, running wild after hours spent trapped in this tiny, suffocating space? I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself, but it wasn't working. The tension in the air was growing thicker, pressing down on me, and the longer I stayed in that cabin, the worse it seemed to get. I couldn't stay here much longer. I had to leave. Even if the storm was still raging outside, even if the trail had turned to mud and the wind made it difficult to see, I couldn't stay in this place. I grabbed my pack, checked to make sure I still had everything I needed, and walked over to the door, my hand once again hovering over the latch. I was about to pull it open when I heard it, this faint, almost imperceptible sound that made me pause. At first, I thought it was just the wind, rattling the cabin like it had been doing all night. But as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was something else, something deliberate. It was coming from the roof, a slow, steady scraping sound like nails dragging across the wood. I stepped back, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It wasn't an animal. I knew that much. It was too deliberate, too measured. It sounded like someone or something was crawling along the roof, circling the cabin, inching closer and closer to where I stood. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing, my mind struggling to process what was happening. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying what I was hearing. Whatever it was up there, and it knew I was down here. I glanced at the window again, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but all I saw was the rain, the storm battering the cabin with relentless fury. The sound above me grew louder, more insistent, like it was searching for a way in. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go outside, not now, not with whatever was up there. But staying inside didn't feel like much of an option either. The roof creaked again, this time louder than before, and I looked up just in time to see a small crack appear in the wood. It wasn't much, just a tiny fissure, but it was enough to make my stomach twist into knots. If the roof gave way, I would be trapped. Panic started to set in, and I backed away from the door, from the windows, from the walls that seemed to close in on me with every passing second. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew. Something was trying to get in, and I was running out of time. The sound on the roof continued, a steady scraping rhythm that matched the beat of the rain outside. I backed into the farthest corner of the cabin, keeping my eyes on the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. The roof creaked again, louder this time, and I heard something shift, like wood splitting under pressure. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I didn't know how much longer the roof would hold, but I knew I had to get out of there before it collapsed, before whatever was up there found a way in. I grabbed my pack, my fingers fumbling with the straps, and made my way to the door. I didn't have a plan, not really, but I knew I couldn't stay inside any longer. I had to get out, even if it meant braving the storm. I reached for the latch, my hand trembling, and pulled the door open. But just as I did, the roof above me groaned, and I looked up in time to see a chunk of wood splinter and fall, crashing onto the floor where I had been standing moments earlier. I didn't wait. I threw open the door and stepped out into the storm, the rain slamming into me with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. But I didn't care. I was out of the cabin, and that was all that mattered. The wind whipped around me, tearing at my clothes and blinding me with sheets of rain, but I kept moving, my feet slipping and sliding on the mud-soaked trail. Behind me, I heard the roof of the cabin give way, the sound of wood snapping and splintering, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Whatever had been on that roof, whatever had been trying to get inside, it wasn't my problem anymore. I was out, and I wasn't going back. I stumbled through the storm, the rain coming down harder than ever, making it nearly impossible to see the trail in front of me. My pack felt heavier with each step, waterlogged and pulling at my shoulders, but I didn't dare stop. The wind howled around me, whipping the trees into a frenzy, their branches thrashing wildly like some kind of chaotic dance. I kept my head down, eyes squinting through the downpour, hoping I was still following the right path. But in my gut, I knew something wasn't right. This storm, there was something about it, something that didn't fit. Storms didn't just appear like this, out of nowhere, with no warning and no sign of letting up. And it wasn't just the ferocity of the wind or the intensity of the rain. There was something else. It felt like the storm was alive, like it had a purpose. I couldn't explain it, but the thought clung to me, nagging at the back of my mind as I pushed forward. The trail ahead was barely visible, just a narrow strip of mud and roots winding through the trees, but I followed it anyway, hoping it would lead me somewhere safe. Anywhere that wasn't the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely made it out in time, that if I had stayed even a minute longer, I wouldn't have left at all. The roof collapsing wasn't just bad luck, or old wood finally giving way to the weather. It felt deliberate, like something had been waiting for me to make a move. I thought back to the journal I'd found, the frantic, half-finished entries describing strange sounds, ominous feelings, and a storm just like this one. Whoever had written those pages, they hadn't made it out. And now, I understood why. The storm wasn't just weather. It was more than that. The realization hit me hard. Though I tried to push it aside, it didn't make sense, not in the way I was used to thinking about things. But the more I considered it, the more it all added up. The storm had trapped me, just like it had trapped whoever came before me. It had come on suddenly, with no warning, as if it had been waiting for me to step into the forest before unleashing itself. And once I was in, it had kept me there, pushing me deeper into the woods, forcing me into that cabin. That cabin wasn't just some old, abandoned structure. It had been a trap, waiting for someone like me. The scratches on the walls, the journal, the eerie stillness inside, all signs that I wasn't the first to find shelter there. But the others, they hadn't been as lucky. I could feel it, lingering in the air even now as I trudged through the storm. There had been more before me, hikers or campers who thought they could outlast the storm, wait for it to pass. They never left. I pushed the thought out of my head and focused on the trail, the rain soaking through my clothes, turning everything heavy and cold. The mud clung to my boots, making every step feel like I was dragging weights behind me. But stopping wasn't an option, not with the storm chasing me. The wind whipped past, and for a brief moment I thought I heard something. Something beyond the howling of the wind and the pounding of the rain. A voice. It was faint, almost lost in the chaos of the storm, but it was there. I stopped, straining to hear it, though every instinct told me to keep moving. It came again, this time clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. It was coming from behind me, back toward the cabin. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, though the rain made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The wind surged again, and this time I heard it more distinctly, someone calling for help. I froze, unsure of what to do. The logical part of my brain told me it was impossible. There was no one else out here, no other hikers that I had seen on the trail. But the voice was so clear, so insistent, and the words were unmistakable now. Help me. It was coming from the direction of the cabin, faint but growing louder with every gust of wind. My first thought was that maybe, somehow, someone had been trapped in the cabin when I left, buried under the collapsed roof. But that didn't make sense. I had been alone in there, hadn't I? I had checked the whole place when I first arrived, and it was empty. Just me, the scratches on the walls, and that journal. Still, the voice persisted, louder now, cutting through the storm with a desperate urgency that made my stomach twist. Against my better judgment, I took a step back toward the sound. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe someone had been trapped in there all along, hidden under the wreckage, and now they needed my help. But even as I moved closer to the source of the voice, something didn't feel right. The air seemed thicker here, more oppressive, like the storm had drawn a boundary around the cabin, trapping not just me, but something else inside. And now, whatever that something was, it wanted me to come back. The voice was louder now, almost insistent, repeating the same two words over and over again. Help me. But it wasn't right. There was something off about it, something that sent a shiver through me despite the warmth of my soaked clothes. It didn't sound natural. It sounded forced, like someone was imitating a voice, mimicking the way a person would ask for help, but missing some crucial element, some spark of humanity. I took another step forward, then stopped myself. The voice was coming from the direction of the cabin, but it wasn't coming from inside the cabin. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line, where the shadows grew deeper and the storm's fury seemed to concentrate. I scanned the area, squinting through the rain, but I couldn't see anything, just the same dark shape I had noticed earlier, half hidden in the trees, barely distinguishable from the trunks around it. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something that had been waiting for me all along. I backed away, slowly at first, my eyes never leaving the spot where the voice had come from. I wasn't going back. Whatever was out there, whatever had been calling me, it wasn't human. I turned and started moving down the trail again, faster this time, the wind pushing against me as if trying to drag me back. The voice faded behind me, but I knew it was still there, lurking in the woods, waiting for another chance to lure me in. As I pressed forward, the realization settled in. The storm wasn't just a storm. It was a trap, designed to pull me in, to make me feel safe inside that cabin, only to close in on me when I least expected it. It had lured me there, isolated me, and now it was trying to bring me back. And I had almost fallen for it. The rain pounded down harder, and the wind howled in my ears, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The cabin was gone now, buried under its own wreckage. But whatever had been inside wasn't finished with me yet. The trail stretched ahead, winding through the trees, and I focused on it, on getting out, on reaching safety before the storm could pull me back into its grasp. But even as I moved further away, I knew. This wasn't over. The storm wasn't done with me, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. I don't remember much about the last stretch of that trail, just the relentless pounding of the rain, the mud clinging to my boots, and the overwhelming need to keep moving. Every gust of wind felt like a hand trying to drag me back, but I kept my eyes fixed ahead, desperate to find something, anything, that would signal I was close to safety. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled out onto a gravel road. The rain still came down in sheets, but the oppressive weight of the storm seemed to lift slightly, like it had lost interest now that I'd escaped its grasp. I didn't stop until I reached the park's ranger station, soaked to the bone, breathless, and feeling as though I'd narrowly escaped something I couldn't fully explain. The rangers took one look at me and asked if I'd been caught in the storm. I nodded, too exhausted to explain what had really happened. How could I? How do you tell someone that a storm, a cabin, and something hiding in the woods had tried to trap you? I stammered something about getting lost and took their offer of a ride back to my car, leaving out all the parts that made no sense. When I tried to explain where I'd found the cabin, the ranger shook his head and told me there were no cabins on that part of the trail. Not anymore. They'd been torn down years ago, after a few hikers had gone missing during a bad storm. That's when it hit me. Those missing hikers, the journal I'd found, the scratches on the walls. I wasn't the first person to end up there, and if I hadn't left when I did, I might have been the next name added to their list. I haven't been back to that park since. Every now and then, I think about that voice. Those two simple words, "help me," and I wonder what might have happened if I'd followed it. But part of me knows the truth. Whatever was in that storm, it wasn't asking for help. It was trying to lure me back. It was one of those perfect late summer evenings, where the air hangs just right, warm but not stifling, with the faintest hint of cooler winds hinting at the coming fall. The kind of evening that makes you want to drop everything and escape to the woods, to breathe in the earth and lose yourself for a few hours. That was exactly my plan when I packed my gear, grabbed my map, and headed out for a solo hike to this obscure trailhead I'd heard about online. I'm not usually one for venturing too far off the beaten path, but something about this trail had piqued my curiosity. A few posts in an outdoor forum had mentioned it. No specifics, just vague references to an old, forgotten route tucked away deep in the forest preserve, miles from any of the more popular trails. It sounded perfect to me. Quiet, a bit of a challenge, and most importantly, no crowds. I parked my car at the gravel lot near the ranger station just before dusk, hoping to get a few solid hours of hiking before setting up camp for the night. The rain had come and gone earlier in the day, leaving everything slightly damp but manageable. The dirt beneath my boots felt soft but not slippery, the kind of terrain that would make for a comfortable, steady hike. The evening sky was painted in those purples and oranges that only last for a few minutes before the night swallows them up entirely. I locked the car, shouldered my pack, and headed down the narrow path that led to the trailhead. It was supposed to be a marked trail according to the basic map I had, though curiously, it wasn't listed on the official park map that I'd grabbed at the ranger station. I assumed it was just an oversight, maybe an old trail that had fallen out of regular maintenance. The forest seemed different as soon as I crossed the threshold onto the trail. I've hiked my fair share of trails, but this one felt oddly untouched. The trees here were older, taller, their canopies so thick that they filtered out what was left of the fading sunlight. The dampness from the earlier rain clung to the leaves and branches, occasionally dripping onto me as I passed beneath. There was a stillness in the air, not the absence of sound, but more like the forest itself was waiting for something. I wasn't unsettled by it, not yet anyway. I found it peaceful, calming even, the kind of isolation I'd been craving after weeks of city noise and deadlines. As I walked, the path narrowed, almost imperceptibly at first, until I found myself weaving between thicker underbrush and low-hanging branches. That was odd. Trails, even old ones, are usually more defined than this, especially in a place like this park where hikers are frequent. I paused for a moment, pulling out my map to check my position. Everything seemed in order. The trail should lead deeper into the forest, curving around a ridge before opening up into a larger, more scenic area, perfect for camping. But as I stood there, looking around, something about the surroundings seemed off. The trail ahead of me wasn't as clear as it should have been, almost like it had started to disappear into the landscape itself. I considered turning back just for a second, but then laughed it off. I'd driven all this way for a quiet hike and some alone time. I wasn't going to let a little overgrowth spook me. So I pressed on, weaving through the narrowing path, the trees crowding closer around me. Every so often, a light breeze would pass through, rustling the leaves just enough to remind me I wasn't completely alone out here, even though the chances of running into another hiker seemed slimmer with each step. The evening was slipping into night faster than I expected. The last bits of daylight were barely filtering through the trees now, casting long, strange shadows that twisted and stretched over the ground. I checked my watch, realizing I had maybe another hour of decent light before I'd need to set up camp. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the ridge before it got too dark to navigate. That's when I noticed the first odd thing, something so small and out of place that it shouldn't have mattered, but it did. There was a signpost ahead, half-rotted and leaning at an odd angle. Its wooden frame was covered in moss and grime, but I could just make out the faded, scratched lettering. The name of the trail had been almost completely worn away by time, but there was a faint outline of what looked like an arrow pointing straight ahead. I remember staring at that sign longer than I should have, something about it not sitting right with me. It was like the forest had forgotten this sign was here, like it had no business still standing. I shook off the weird feeling, chalking it up to the gathering darkness and the encroaching shadows playing tricks on my mind. I kept moving forward, the trail ahead now more of a suggestion than an actual path. The undergrowth thickened further, and more than once I had to push through a tangle of branches and brush, leaving wet streaks on my jacket from the earlier rain. I hadn't planned for the trail to be this rough, but I still wasn't overly concerned. In fact, part of me welcomed the challenge, feeling like I was walking a path no one had tread in years. There was something almost thrilling about it, but then the trail just stopped. One minute, I was pushing through thick underbrush, and the next I was standing at the edge of a sheer drop-off. The ridge was right in front of me, as expected, but instead of curving gently down into the valley like the map had shown, it ended abruptly in a jagged cliff. There was no warning, no gradual incline. It was like the earth had just given up, crumbling away into nothing below. I stepped back, unsure of what to make of it. This wasn't what the map had shown at all. I glanced back at the fading path behind me, now almost swallowed by the thickening shadows, and that's when I heard it. A sound I couldn't quite place, soft at first, barely noticeable over the rustling leaves, but unmistakable once I focused on it. Whispers, low, indistinct, and coming from somewhere behind me. I stood there for what felt like too long, staring into the thickening shadows behind me, trying to make sense of the faint sound drifting through the trees. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't some animal rustling around in the underbrush. It was low, constant, and undeniably human, or at least it had that quality to it. Like someone was murmuring just out of earshot, their words blurring together in an indistinct hum. I turned back to the cliff edge, hoping to reorient myself, but the sight in front of me didn't make sense either. There was no valley below, no gradual descent as the map had indicated. Just a sharp drop-off that led into a swirling mist, the kind that rises after a rain, heavy and still, but moving in strange, unnatural patterns as if it were alive. This wasn't where I was supposed to be. I pulled out the map again, flattening it against my thigh, the paper still slightly damp from the moisture in the air. The route I'd been following was clearly marked. No cliffs, no sudden end, just a winding trail leading to a ridge with scenic views. But the reality in front of me wasn't lining up with what I'd expected. I traced the path with my finger, following the thin red line that should have led me further into the forest, past the ridge and deeper into the preserve. The trail was supposed to curve to the right, not end abruptly like this. I flipped the map over, hoping for some kind of explanation, and that's when I noticed something odd. In the bottom corner, faint but visible, was a small, almost faded note in handwriting that didn't match the printed text. "Stay on the marked path." I hadn't seen that before. The ink was smudged and uneven, like someone had added it hastily, and it was clear the note hadn't been part of the original map. I blinked at it, feeling a wave of confusion wash over me. I hadn't strayed from the trail, had I? I mean, sure, the path had gotten overgrown, but I'd been following the markers, at least the ones I'd seen. But now that I thought about it, I couldn't recall the last time I'd seen a trail marker. The signpost I'd passed earlier was the only indication that I was even on a trail at all, and that sign had looked old, out of place, like it didn't belong here anymore. The whispers drifted closer, almost as if they'd grown bolder, no longer content to stay hidden in the background noise. I turned around, scanning the darkening woods behind me, and that's when I saw it. A shape just barely visible through the trees, standing still, watching. I froze, squinting to make out any details, but the fading light and the mist made it impossible to tell if it was a person or something else. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, half obscured by the shadows. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the edges of the map. Part of me wanted to call out, ask if someone else was out here, but something stopped me. The figure felt wrong, out of place in the same way the trail did, like it shouldn't have been there. The whispers grew louder, and for a second, I was sure they were coming from the figure itself. I looked down at the map again, my brain scrambling to make sense of the situation. That's when I noticed the paper had changed. It wasn't just the smudged writing in the corner anymore. There were symbols now, scattered across the page in places where there hadn't been anything before. Small, crude drawings that looked like circles and triangles, connected by thin lines. They weren't printed, they'd been drawn by hand, and recently, judging by how fresh the ink looked. I flipped the map over again, wondering if I'd missed something earlier, but the back was blank, just the standard park information. My mind raced, trying to figure out where these symbols had come from, how they could have appeared without me noticing. I looked back toward the figure, but it was gone. Just the trees now, dark and dense, with the mist swirling lazily between them. I took a step back, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to keep going, to find a way down the cliff and continue on. But another part of me, the rational part, knew something was wrong. The trail wasn't supposed to be like this. The whispers hadn't stopped either. They were still there, soft but insistent, tugging at the edges of my mind. I turned to head back, retracing my steps through the brush, but as I did, the landscape shifted again. The trail behind me, the one I just walked, was different. The trees seemed closer together, the path narrower, as if the forest itself was closing in around me. I blinked, looking around, disoriented. I'd only taken a few steps away from the cliff, but already it felt like I was miles away from where I'd been moments ago. There were no familiar landmarks, no sign of the trailhead I'd entered from. The forest, once thick but navigable, had become a maze of tangled branches and low-hanging limbs, making it nearly impossible to move without stumbling over roots and rocks. I stopped, listening, but the whispers had faded now, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence that weighed heavily in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Not just from one direction, but from everywhere at once, hidden in the dense foliage, waiting. I pushed forward, trying to keep my bearings, but every few steps the landscape seemed to change, like the forest was actively working against me. I pulled out my phone, hoping to check the GPS again, but there was no signal, nothing but the faint glow of the screen showing me a blank map. Frustration bubbled up inside me as I shoved the phone back into my pocket and pressed on, determined to find the trailhead again. But with each step, the forest seemed to close in tighter, the path shrinking until it was barely wide enough for me to walk through. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing, just the dark, twisted trees and the swirling mist. The light was fading fast now, the last remnants of evening giving way to the deep blue of twilight. I could barely make out the trail beneath my feet anymore, the dirt path blending into the underbrush. That's when I saw it, another signpost, this one even more rotted and decayed than the first. It was barely standing, its wooden frame warped and twisted, but I could just make out the letters scratched into the surface. They were different from the first sign. These letters didn't form words. They were symbols, the same ones that had appeared on the map. I stood there staring at the decaying signpost, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Those symbols, they matched the ones that had appeared on the map, crudely drawn circles and triangles connected by those thin lines that made no sense. This wasn't a language I recognized, wasn't anything I'd seen on any other trail, and yet, here they were, etched into the wood, as if they'd always been there. I took a step closer, squinting in the dim light, trying to make out more details. But the wood was so weathered it looked like it might crumble under the slightest touch. I reached out anyway, curiosity getting the better of me, my fingers grazing the rough surface. The symbols were cold, unnaturally cold, as if the wood had absorbed the chill from the rain, though the air around me was still relatively warm. That's when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of whispers rising from somewhere behind me, closer this time, more urgent. I jerked my hand back, spinning around, half expecting to see the figure again, but the forest was empty, at least as far as I could tell. The mist had thickened, swirling in dense patterns between the trees, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Everything felt disjointed, like the ground beneath me was shifting. But when I looked down, the trail was still there, though barely visible now, just a faint outline in the earth. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to push through the underbrush, and get as far away from that signpost as possible. But another part of me, an irrational part, felt drawn to it. There was something about those symbols, something ancient and deeply wrong, but at the same time I couldn't shake the feeling that they held some kind of answer. I glanced at the map again, hoping for clarity, but the symbols had multiplied. They were spreading, covering more of the page, and now I could see they weren't random. They formed a pattern, a strange jagged path that twisted through the forest, intersecting with the trail I was on. The realization hit me slowly, creeping in like the mist around my feet. The map wasn't guiding me out of the forest, it was guiding me into it, into whatever lay beyond that cliff, beyond the safety of the trail. I folded the map quickly, shoving it back into my pocket, my heart pounding in my ears. I had to get out of here. I turned back the way I'd come, determined to retrace my steps, but the path had changed again. The trail that had been there moments ago was gone, swallowed by the thickening fog and the overgrown branches that now seemed to stretch across the ground, twisting like skeletal fingers. Panic welled up inside me, but I pushed it down, forcing myself to move, to push through the underbrush, even as the branches scraped against my legs and snagged at my clothes. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, overlapping and insistent, calling out from all directions. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. It wasn't a warning, it was a demand. Something wanted me to follow that path, to abandon the trail and go deeper into the forest, into the mist, into whatever lay beyond that cliff. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I stumbled forward, my feet catching on roots and rocks as I tried to find the trail again, but the forest was relentless. The trees seemed to shift in front of me, their trunks bending and warping in the fog, blocking my way at every turn. It was like the forest itself was alive, rearranging itself to keep me here. The thought sent a cold wave of realization through me, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I had to move, had to get out before it was too late. I pulled out my phone again, hoping against hope for a signal, but the screen was useless. Just a black void with no service. No GPS, nothing. I shoved it back into my pocket, cursing under my breath, and kept moving. The mist was getting thicker now, so thick that I could barely see my own hands in front of me. The trees were nothing more than dark shapes in the fog, their branches reaching out like twisted arms, and I had no idea where I was anymore. I stumbled again, this time catching my foot on something hard and uneven, sending me sprawling onto the damp ground. I cursed, pushing myself up, but when I looked down to see what had tripped me, my breath caught in my throat. It was another signpost, half buried in the dirt, its wooden frame splintered and broken. The same symbols were etched into it, though these were much deeper, carved with something sharp and deliberate. I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the signpost, but as I did, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. It was the same low, steady hum I'd heard before, but now it was different, clearer, more defined. The voices weren't just whispers anymore, they were chants. A low, rhythmic sound that seemed to rise up from the earth itself, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. I backed up further, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away from the sound. But it didn't stop. The chanting was everywhere now, surrounding me, coming from the trees, the ground, the air itself. And then, through the mist, I saw it again. The figure. It was standing just a few feet away, barely visible through the fog, but this time I could make out more details. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a person, but something about them was wrong. Their outline was jagged, blurred, as if they were flickering in and out of existence. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were watching me, waiting. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I knew that if I didn't move, if I didn't get out of here right now, I wouldn't make it out at all. I turned and ran. Branches slapped against my face and arms as I pushed through the underbrush, the fog so thick I could barely see where I was going. The forest felt like a maze, every turn leading me deeper into its grasp, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The chanting followed me, growing louder with each step, until it felt like it was inside my head, drowning out everything else. I had no idea where I was going, no sense of direction, no trail to follow. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. The fog thinned, and the forest around me seemed to shift, the trees parting to reveal a narrow, winding path. The trail. I didn't hesitate. I bolted down the path, not caring where it led, just desperate to put as much distance between myself and whatever was in that forest. The trees blurred past me, the mist fading as I ran, until finally I saw it, the trailhead. I stumbled out of the woods, gasping for breath, my legs burning from the effort, but I didn't care. I was out. I was safe. I turned back toward the forest, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. Just the trees, silent and still, with no sign of the mist, the chanting, or the figure that had followed me. But as I stood there catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That somehow, some way, I'd only just escaped. I stood there, leaning heavily against a tree at the trailhead, breathing hard, trying to piece together what had just happened. The forest behind me was quiet now, almost peaceful in its stillness, but the image of that figure, half hidden in the mist, was burned into my mind. I knew something had gone terribly wrong out there, something I couldn't explain. I pulled the map from my pocket again, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. Those symbols, the ones that hadn't been there when I first started the hike, were still spread across the page like a twisted web. My eyes followed the jagged lines and the strange hand-drawn markings, trying to make sense of them, trying to understand how this had happened. None of it made sense. The trail I'd taken had been clear at first, well-worn even, but the deeper I'd gone, the more everything had changed. And now, standing at the trailhead, I was certain of one thing. I hadn't been walking on the trail I thought I was. Whatever path I'd followed, it wasn't the one on the map. The symbols, the whispers, the figure. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something much older, something buried in the past that should have been left alone. I thought back to that note, the one scrawled in the corner of the map. Stay on the marked path. Someone had left that warning, maybe decades ago, knowing that something was wrong here. But I hadn't listened. I'd followed my own instincts, thinking I knew better. And now I was standing at the edge of something I didn't understand. I looked down at the map again, tracing the path I'd taken with my finger, but the route didn't match the reality I'd experienced. The map showed a ridge, a clear path, a gentle descent into the valley. But the cliff, the mist, the shifting forest, none of that was marked. It was like the trail had changed beneath my feet, or maybe it had always been different. As the thought settled into my mind, another memory surfaced, something I'd read online before setting out for this hike. A post in one of the hiking forums, buried deep in a thread about lost trails and unexplained disappearances. Someone had mentioned this area, this exact stretch of forest, claiming that the trails didn't always stay in the same place. At the time, I dismissed it as nonsense, the kind of tall tale people tell to add mystery to an otherwise mundane place. But now, standing here with that map in my hands, I wasn't so sure anymore. I remembered the story clearly now, the details coming back in vivid flashes. The post had talked about a group of hikers from the 1920s who had disappeared without a trace while exploring this very park. Their bodies were never found, but their gear, tents, supplies, even their maps, had been discovered weeks later, scattered along a trail that no longer existed. The official explanation was that they'd gotten lost, that bad weather or poor visibility had caused them to stray from the path, and they'd fallen victim to the elements. But the locals, according to the post, told a different story. They claimed that the hikers had been led astray, that the forest itself had turned against them, changing the trail beneath their feet and trapping them in some kind of limbo, a place where the past and the present blurred together. I hadn't believed it then, but now, I looked back at the forest, at the dark, twisting trees and the thick fog that seemed to hang just beyond the trailhead. Could that be what had happened to me? Had I somehow stepped off the real trail and into something else, some other version of the path that existed outside of time? It seemed ridiculous, impossible even, but after what I'd just experienced, it was hard to deny that something strange was happening out here. The symbols on the map, the whispers, the figure, none of it could be explained by logic or reason, but they were real. They had happened, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that those symbols weren't random markings. They were a map of their own, a map to something. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been following a path that wasn't meant to be walked, that I had somehow stumbled into a space that existed outside the natural order of things. The realization hit me slowly, creeping into my mind like the mist that had surrounded me out there. I hadn't just gotten lost. I had been led to that cliff, to that figure, to the symbols that had appeared on the map without explanation. Led into a part of the forest that had no place on any modern map, a place where time had frayed at the edges and bled into the present. I thought again of the hikers from the 1920s, of the stories about their disappearance, and a cold chill ran down my spine as I wondered if they had followed the same path I had, if they had heard the same whispers, if they had seen the same figure. I glanced down at the map again, half expecting to see more symbols appear, but the page remained still, the ink unmoving, though the patterns seemed to pulse with a strange energy. I folded the map and shoved it into my pocket, unwilling to look at it any longer. I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave this place behind and never return. But as I turned to go, the thought of the missing hikers nagged at me. What had happened to them? Had they ever found their way back, or had they been swallowed by the forest, their fate sealed the moment they stepped off the trail? And what about me? Had I escaped, or was I still walking the same twisted path, trapped in a loop I didn't even understand? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind, but the questions lingered, refusing to be answered. The sun had long since set, and the darkness around me was thick, pressing in from all sides. I should have left by now, should have gotten in my car and driven away, but something held me there, standing at the edge of the trailhead, staring into the forest. There was a part of me, a small, irrational part, that wanted to go back, to see if the figure was still there, to find out where the whispers were coming from, to trace those symbols on the map to their source. But I knew better. I'd barely escaped with my sanity intact. Going back would be a mistake, and whatever was out there, whatever had led me down that path, wasn't finished with me yet. I turned my back on the forest and walked toward my car, my mind still buzzing with questions I couldn't answer. The past, it seemed, wasn't as far behind me as I'd thought. Weeks have passed since that hike, and yet it hasn't left me. Every time I try to move on, to put it behind me, something pulls me back to that night. The map, the symbols, the figure in the mist. I've told a few friends about what happened, but I downplayed the strange parts, made it sound like a case of getting turned around on an unfamiliar trail. I could see the skepticism in their faces, the way they smiled but didn't quite believe me. And honestly, who could blame them? I barely believe it myself. But there are moments, late at night, when I hear things, faint, distant whispers that seem to rise up from the quiet corners of my mind. I tell myself it's nothing, just an echo of the memory, a leftover from the fear and confusion I felt out there. But deep down, I know it's more than that. That map, folded and tucked away in the bottom of my hiking pack, still has those symbols scrawled across it. I've thought about burning it, getting rid of it entirely, but some irrational part of me can't. It feels like the map is waiting, like there's more to the story that I've only begun to uncover. I've caught myself staring at it, tracing the lines with my fingers, feeling the pull of whatever lies beyond that trailhead, beyond the place where the real path ends and something else begins. I haven't been back to the forest since, and I don't plan to, but the whispers follow me, and part of me wonders if they always will. The rain had been falling for hours, a steady, relentless drizzle that blurred the horizon into a smudge of gray and brown. The sound of it against the windshield was hypnotic, almost lulling me into a trance as we drove deeper into the desert. Jake was focused on the road ahead, squinting through the streaks of rain as the headlights bounced off the wet rocks and scrubby brush. We had talked about camping here for months, eager to escape the grind of daily life and find some peace in the open wilderness. Now that we were here, miles from the nearest town, the isolation felt much heavier than I'd imagined. We weren't seasoned campers, not by a long shot, but Jake had insisted this spot was perfect. Remote, quiet, and far from the crowds we were trying to leave behind. The campsite was nothing more than a clearing surrounded by jagged rocks, with the ground sloping slightly toward a deep pit at its center. I hadn't noticed the pit on the map, but Jake assured me it was just an old mine shaft, probably abandoned years ago. He had a way of brushing off anything that might seem unsettling, always the first to shrug off strange details as nothing to worry about. But there was something about the pit, the way it seemed to swallow sound, the way the rain disappeared into its depths without a trace, that left me uneasy. Jake, of course, wasn't fazed at all. He was already out of the car, unloading the gear and pulling the tent from the trunk. moving with the same easy confidence he always had. I grabbed my jacket and followed, the rain immediately soaking into my clothes as I stepped out into the open. The air smelled damp and earthy, the kind of scent that clung to your skin and made you feel like you were part of the landscape. As we worked to set up the tent, the sound of the rain hitting the taut fabric became a constant background noise, blending with the distant rumble of thunder. The pit was just a few yards away, a gaping black hole in the ground, surrounded by loose rocks and crumbling dirt. I couldn't help but glance over at it every few minutes, half expecting something to emerge from its depths, though I knew that was ridiculous. We finished setting up just as the light began to fade, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple as the rain continued to fall. Jake lit the small propane stove, his face illuminated by the flickering flame, and started heating up a can of beans for dinner. We ate in silence, both of us too tired from the drive to make much conversation, the rain still pattering softly around us. The night was settling in, and with it came a quiet felt too thick, too absolute, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. That's when I first heard it, a distant, muffled sound that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the rain, but something else, something deeper. I turned to Jake, but he was busy cleaning up, completely unaware of the strange noise that seemed to come from the direction of the pit. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe the isolation and the rain were playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it again, louder this time, a faint but unmistakable scream carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear, waiting for Jake to notice, but he remained oblivious, humming quietly to himself as he packed away the dishes. The scream came again, long and low, like it was rising up from the earth itself, echoing through the stillness of the night. I stood up, my eyes locked on the pit, its darkness yawning wide and bottomless just beyond the edge of the firelight. Something was down there. The morning arrived slowly, as if the desert itself was reluctant to shake off the weight of the night. The sky above was still heavy with clouds, and the rain had settled into a fine mist that clung to everything it touched. The ground around our camp was slick, the dirt turned to thick mud that squelched underfoot as I stepped out of the tent. Jake was already up, crouched near the stove, working on breakfast, as though nothing strange had happened the night before. He didn't mention the sounds from the pit, and I wasn't sure if I should bring it up, part of me still questioning whether I had really heard them at all. But the scream echoed in my mind, its faint, distant wail, impossible to shake, even as I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. The rain had muffled so much last night, and I wondered if the desert played tricks on your senses out here, with nothing but rocks and silence for miles. Jake handed me a mug of coffee, steam rising in the cool morning air, and nodded toward the pit without a word. We both looked at it, sitting there like a black hole in the earth, wide and gaping, as if it could swallow everything around it without a trace. There was something unsettling about the way it sat there, motionless and quiet, even as the mist hovered just above the ground. Probably just some old mine, Jake finally said, breaking the silence between us, though his voice had an edge that made me doubt he believed his own words. We hadn't talked much about the pit since we arrived, but it was impossible to ignore. Its presence loomed over the campsite like an unwanted guest. I sipped my coffee, not really tasting it, my mind drifting back to the journal we found near the pit's edge the day before. Jake had tossed it aside, calling it old junk, but something about the scribbled writing in the miner's journal had stayed with me. The last entry, in particular, was burned into my memory. The noises are getting louder. Something is moving down there, and it's not human. I hadn't told Jake about that line. It felt too ridiculous to share, too far-fetched to bring up in casual conversation over breakfast in the middle of nowhere. But now, standing there in the cold morning mist, the pit just a few yards away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from below. "Let's check it out again after breakfast," Jake said, his casual tone not matching the tension in the air between us. He was always the curious one, always wanting to explore, but today I wasn't so sure that was a good idea. Still, I nodded, not wanting to seem paranoid, even though every part of me wanted to stay as far away from that pit as possible. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully, the rain continuing its steady drizzle, as if the desert was content to sit under a veil of moisture for the entire day. But that pit, it was like a magnet, pulling our attention back to it again and again, as if it was daring us to come closer. When we finally approached it, I felt an odd sense of dread settling over me, though I tried to brush it off as just nerves from being in such an isolated place. The rocks around the pit's edge were slick with rain, and as we stood there looking down into the abyss, I realized just how deep it really was. The darkness inside seemed to stretch endlessly, no bottom in sight, and the sound of the rain seemed to vanish the moment it fell past the lip of the pit. Jake crouched down, picking up one of the old rusted tools left behind by the miners who had once worked here, his face twisted in a mixture of curiosity and unease. "Doesn't look like anyone's been down there for decades," he said, his voice barely audible over the soft patter of rain. But even as he said it, I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. What if something still is down there? I found myself stepping back from the edge, as though the ground might give way at any moment and send me tumbling into the blackness below. There was a strange hum in the air, faint but noticeable, like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then, just like the night before, I heard it again, a sound rising up from the depths, faint but unmistakable like a distant scream. Jake froze, his eyes darting to mine, and for the first time I saw fear flash across his face, confirming that he had heard it too. We stood there, frozen in place, both of us staring into the pit as the scream echoed faintly from its depths. The rain had picked up again, heavier now, soaking into our clothes and making everything slick and uncomfortable, but neither of us moved. Jake glanced at me, his face pale, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The only sound around us, the constant drumming of the rain and that faint, eerie noise rising from below. "What the hell is that?" Jake finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking any louder might bring whatever was down there closer to the surface. I shook my head, not trusting myself to say anything that wouldn't sound ridiculous, even though I knew exactly what it sounded like. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't the wind, and it sure as hell wasn't my imagination. The scream, it was unmistakably human, or something trying to sound human. "We should leave," I muttered, my voice hoarse, the words falling between us like lead. But Jake was already leaning closer to the edge, peering down into the blackness with a look of grim fascination. "Hold on. Maybe there's an old shaft that collapsed. Maybe someone fell in," he said, but there was no confidence in his voice. It sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than me. The rain continued to fall, each drop vanishing into the mouth of the pit, as if the earth was swallowing everything whole. I backed away, feeling the pull of the darkness, a sensation I couldn't explain but one that made my entire body tense. "We can't just leave if someone's down there," Jake insisted, but even as he said it, he didn't move any closer. He looked at the old mining equipment scattered around, as if searching for something that could help, but everything was rusted and useless. The scream echoed again, longer this time, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. "There's no way. No one could survive down there for this long," I said. But I knew that logic didn't matter right now. The scream wasn't about survival. It was about something else entirely. Jake started rummaging through the backpack, pulling out a long length of rope that we had brought for climbing, his hands moving quickly, his face set in determination. "I'm gonna check it out," he muttered, already tying the rope around a sturdy rock, his eyes never leaving the pit. I felt my heart race, panic setting in, but I didn't know how to stop him. Jake had always been the one to push limits, the one to take risks, but this was something else. "Jake, don't. This isn't right. You can't just go down there," I said, my voice barely audible over the rain, but he wasn't listening. He threw the rope over the edge, the sound of it hitting the side of the pit, barely audible as the rain fell harder, pounding against the rocky ground. I stood there, watching, knowing that nothing good could come from this, but unable to stop him. "Just hold the rope." "I'll be quick," he said, giving me one last glance before he started lowering himself down, disappearing into the darkness with each slow, deliberate step. I grabbed the rope, my hands wet and cold, gripping it tightly as I felt his weight pulling against it. I wanted to shout at him, to tell him to come back, but the words stuck in my throat. The scream from the pit was louder now, almost rhythmic, like whatever was down there was waiting for him. I leaned over the edge, watching as Jake's headlamp flickered on, casting a weak beam of light into the pit, illuminating nothing but slick rock and the endless black void below. The light disappeared as he descended further, swallowed by the darkness, and I was left, standing alone at the edge, holding onto the rope, listening to the rain and the screams that seemed to grow louder the deeper he went. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity, as the rope jerked slightly in my hands, indicating he was still moving. The screams stopped suddenly, replaced by a deafening silence that filled the air, making the rain seem distant and unreal. I called out to him, my voice shaky and thin, but there was no response. More minutes passed, and the silence grew heavier, pressing down on me with a weight I couldn't explain. And then the rope jerked violently, almost pulling me off my feet, the sudden movement startling me so much that I nearly lost my grip. I shouted his name again, but all I heard in response was a low, guttural sound from below, something that didn't sound like Jake at all. The rope in my hands jerked again, harder this time, sending a surge of panic through me as I struggled to keep my grip on the wet, slick cord. The rain had turned into a steady downpour now, soaking everything, making the ground even more treacherous, and the rope feel like it could slip through my fingers at any moment. Jake had been silent for far too long, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong the moment he disappeared into that pit. I shouted his name again, my voice cracking as it echoed briefly before being swallowed by the vast emptiness below. There was no response, only the sound of the rain and the eerie silence that now seemed to emanate from the pit, as though it had devoured not just Jake, but the very air around us. I tugged on the rope lightly, hoping to feel some kind of movement, some sign that he was still down there and just out of earshot, but the line stayed taut and unmoving, like it was caught on something far below. Another minute passed, then two, and the pit felt more alive with each passing second, its gaping mouth wider, darker, as though it was drawing me toward it. I knew I should pull him up, that something had gone terribly wrong, but my body refused to move, my hands gripping the rope tighter as though letting go meant sealing both our fates. Then, from deep within the pit, there was a sound. A scraping, dragging noise, like something heavy was being pulled along the rocks, but it didn't sound like Jake. It was slow, deliberate, and growing louder with each second, reverberating up through the walls of the pit, sending vibrations through the rope in my hands. I called out again, desperate now, but still nothing came back, only that relentless dragging sound inching closer and closer to the surface. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be happening down there, visions of Jake trapped, hurt, or worse, and the thought of something else moving in the dark, something I couldn't see but could hear. Suddenly, the rope went slack in my hands, the weight disappearing completely, and I stumbled, back in shock, nearly losing my balance on the slippery ground. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the rain hammering down and the empty pit yawning before me. Then the scream came again, louder than ever before, but this time it wasn't faint or distant. It was right at the edge of the pit, bursting out of the darkness with a force that sent me reeling back. It wasn't Jake. The sound was wrong, distorted, like multiple voices all screaming at once, each one more twisted and tortured than the last. I scrambled backward, my feet slipping in the mud, my hands scrambling for purchase as I tried to get away from the edge, away from whatever was clawing its way up toward me. The rope was still slack, lying limp on the ground, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still holding it, deep within the pit, something far worse than I could imagine. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by a different kind of movement, something faster, more deliberate, like claws scraping against rock, and it was getting closer with every second. I wanted to run, to get as far away from the pit as possible, but my legs felt rooted to the ground, as if the weight of the rain and the air itself was holding me in place. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shook violently, a low rumble that seemed to come from the pit itself, sending loose rocks tumbling down into the abyss. I stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to catch myself, my eyes fixed on the pit as something began to emerge from the darkness. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker of movement at the edge of the light cast by the campfire, but as it moved closer, I could see it more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, its body hunched over as it dragged itself out of the pit. Its skin, if you could call it that, was dark and slick, like it had been pulled from the depths of the earth itself, glistening wet in the rain. The worst part was its face, or the lack of one. Where its eyes and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless darkness, as if it had been wiped clean by whatever horrors lived below. I scrambled backward again, my heart pounding in my chest as the creature pulled itself fully out of the pit, its long fingers clawing into the mud as it straightened up, towering over me. The scream came again, but this time it didn't come from the creature. It came from deep within the pit, as if something else was still down there, waiting to follow it up. The creature turned its head toward me, the featureless face locking on to me as if it could see, even without eyes, and I knew then that Jake was gone, that whatever had been down there had taken him, replaced him. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The pit, the creature, the screams, they were all too much, and all I could do was watch as it stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, its long limbs reaching out toward me. The rain fell harder. The pit behind the creature seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive, and I knew that if I didn't move now, I would be next. I don't remember how I ran. I don't remember the exact moment when I finally tore myself away from that thing, but I must have, because I'm still here, telling you this. The rain was pouring, heavier than I had ever felt, and it was like the entire desert was trying to wash away what I had just seen. I didn't look back at the pit. I couldn't. Every instinct told me not to stop, not to think, just to keep moving. The campsite disappeared behind me, swallowed by the rain and darkness, and the only thing I could hear was my own labored breathing mixed with the steady downpour. The car was there, barely visible through the sheets of rain, and somehow my shaking hands found the keys and the ignition. I drove without seeing, my eyes blurred by the rain and my mind numbed from the shock of what had just happened. I couldn't think about Jake. Not then. I couldn't let myself process what had happened to him, or what had come out of that pit. It took hours before I reached anything resembling civilization, and even then, I didn't stop. I kept driving, the rain following me like a shadow, a reminder of what I had left behind. I haven't told anyone else this story. It feels too impossible, too unreal, even though I know what I saw. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear it. That scream, distant but undeniable, like it's calling me back to the pit.